The Crown has issued a decree. In 12 days, the Baron is to marry 5 women from 5 different houses. It sounds like a great blessing, except the castle is in ruins, a land at the edge of the world. No money, no army, no magic. And then he realizes this isn't a wedding, it's a funeral disguised as a celebration. With a single stroke of the pen, the Crown removes 6 unnecessary figures from the board, 5 women who need to be gotten rid of, 1 Baron whom no one will miss. Elegant. It's even beautiful if you think about it. Except the Baron is smirking, and he shouldn't be smirking, because Daniel N. Westerlin has just woken up in this body. A minute ago, he was lying on the wet Chicago asphalt with a knife in his right side, and now he's staring at a cracked stone ceiling, a spider web in the corner, a canopy the color of old blood, and 2 heads in someone else's memories. The body's former owner died of a fever at the age of 20. The new owner had spent 8 years yelling at warehouse managers and pulling one department after another out of the hole. 3 people are leaning over him, a tearful maid with a wet rag, a second older woman who has already come to terms with the funeral, and the gray-haired manager, Alvin, with a posture as if 40 years ago they'd stuck a head and forgotten to pull it out. Alvin holds a scroll bearing the golden seal of the Royal Chancery, and his hands are trembling. He reads aloud the verdict disguised as mercy, the decree on arranged marriages. Daniel unfolds the parchment, reads it 3 times, and places it on his lap. 5 names of brides, but 1 name, his. And at this point, anyone else would have screamed or burst into tears. But Daniel thinks of Chicago, of the 30-person team, of the budget they slashed every quarter, of the deadlines they set yesterday, of warehouse number 4, which flooded twice that year, and every time he pulled it off. Not because he's a genius, because he knew how to look at chaos and see structure. 5 wives isn't even a team, it's a small department. He stands up, his legs are shaking. Alvin rushes over to support him, but Daniel raises his hand. He stands, he sways, but he stands. And his first question isn't about the wedding, or his wives, or the decree. He asks how much flour is in the cellars. Alvin blinks, asks again. He can't believe his ears. Daniel repeats himself. How many sacks of flour? How many barrels of salted meat? How much firewood? How many mouths to feed every day? And as the answers come, his face darkens. Enough flour for 3 weeks. The salted meat is running out. Firewood until the middle of next month if the winter is mild. And it won't be mild. There are 27 people in the castle, 4 of them the cook's children, who eat but don't work. The roof in the west wing is leaking. The well has silted up. They haul water from a stream a quarter of a mile away. The stable is empty. The last horse was sold 2 months ago to pay off a debt to the miller. Daniel listens and does the math. How much comes in, how much goes out, where the holes are, where they can be plugged. It's a rotten situation. The castle is already on its last legs, and with 5 extra mouths to feed, or more likely 15 if each bride has even a couple of maids, everything will collapse by midwinter. He demands the records, income, expenses, debts, contracts. Olvin spreads his hands. The former Baron kept his accounts in his head, but the former Baron's head now belongs to Daniel, and it's a blank slate when it comes to that. Daniel closes his eyes for 3 seconds. Back in Chicago, he once took over the books from a manager who kept his records on cafeteria napkins. He sorted it out in a week. It'll be just as simple here. The napkins will just be made of parchment. He demands paper, a pen, and ink. For 10 minutes, he battles with a quill pen and smudges. The handwriting turns out monstrous, but legible. On the first sheet, he writes 3 words: food, heat, roof. Under each, a list. What's available, what's needed, who will do it. Alvin stands nearby and watches. For 32 years, he has served the family. He saw the current Baron's father. He saw his grandfather. Not one of them ever went down to the cellar to count the sacks. Housekeeping was beneath their dignity. They hunted, drank, and sometimes fought. But this boy, who was dying just yesterday, sits with a quill and repairs the lock with his bare hands. By evening, Daniel goes down to the cellar himself. Holding onto the wall, he walks slowly. Alvin shines a lantern. Against the far wall are 6 barrels of fish, once salted. The salt ran out 2 months ago. They didn't buy any more because it was too expensive. The top layer is slimy and stinks so badly that the manager turns away and says they were planning to throw it out. Daniel opens the 2nd barrel, the 3rd, the 4th. He sniffs, feels around, and pulls out a fish. The middle is still okay, not perfect, but edible. He asks if there's a smokehouse. There's an old shed, but they haven't used it in 10 years. Is there firewood? Yes, alder. Daniel himself has never smoked fish before, but one of his drivers in Chicago, a Pole named Christoph, would bring smoked mackerel to work every Friday and lecture everyone on temperature, time, and the proper way to stack the fish. Daniel didn't listen out of interest. He listened because Christoph worked better when he felt appreciated. And so those Friday monologues about alder smoke turned out to be the most valuable knowledge in his new life. He orders everyone who's able-bodied to be summoned. 6 people show up: a cook, 2 stable hands without horses, a laundress, a boy of about 13, the gardener's son, and the gardener himself in his 60s. His knees ache, but his hands are as strong as roots. Daniel assigns the tasks: sort through the fish, throw out the rotten ones, wash the good ones in the stream, gut them, and rub them down. He finds a small bag of pepper and a bunch of dried dill in the kitchen. Not much, but enough. Then they'll smoke it, slowly, over alder sawdust. He doesn't know the exact proportions or the exact time either, but he knows the principle. And he knows that out of 6 barrels of rotten fish, they can save at least half if they act now. They'll start tomorrow morning. Daniel stands nearby and gives orders, not because he knows better, but because someone has to say what to do next. Chef Barris, a heavy-set, taciturn man with a butcher's hands and a chef's eyes, grasps the idea in 10 minutes and takes the lead from there. The smell of alder smoke permeates the entire castle. Servants walk past the smokehouse and swallow hard. On the 3rd day, Barris brings out the first batch: golden bronze, a dark crust, a smell that even makes Olvin, who hasn't smiled in the past decade, lift the corner of his mouth. 4 out of 6 barrels were saved, enough food for 3 weeks for the entire castle. Food that was supposed to be thrown away. Daniel isn't celebrating. He sits down at his list, crosses out 1 line, adds 3 new ones. On the 5th day, the first bride arrived. Daniel was standing in the courtyard when a wagon drove through the gate. Not a carriage, a wagon. An ordinary peasant cart with a gray canvas awning and a single horse that looked as if it hadn't been fed in 3 days. 2 people sat in the cart, a woman in a dark traveling dress and a maid who was so frightened she clung to the side of the cart with both hands. Serafina Inholt, 24 years old, the eldest daughter of a trading house that once owned half the markets on the southern coast. Daniel knew about her from a scroll: name, age, house, nothing else. She climbed down from the wagon on her own, without waiting for help. Tall, red hair pulled back into a tight bun, dark eyes, a beautiful face, but so closed off it was as if a lock had been placed on it and the key thrown away. She looked at the castle, at the peeling walls, at the courtyard with its cracked flagstones, at the empty stable. Then she looked at Daniel. He was standing in a re-sewn doublet that hung on him like a coat on a hanger, pale, thin, with dark circles under his eyes. 20 years old, judging by his physique, but his eyes were different. His eyes were older. She didn't say a word. She simply walked past him into the castle. A maid ran after her, dragging a trunk that was heavier than she was. Alvin showed Serafina to her room, the best one available. Daniel had arranged it the day before. A new bed, clean sheets, a candle, a pitcher of water, a basin for washing. Small things, but he remembered them. When a new employee arrives on their first day and there isn't even a pen on their desk, they already hate the company. Serafina entered the room. She looked around. She said nothing. She closed the door. Daniel heard the bolt click into place. Alvin looked at him with a sympathetic expression. Daniel shrugged. He wasn't expecting a hug. If he were in her place, he would have closed the door too. 2 hours later, he sent a maid with food: bread, cheese, smoked fish, the same kind, a mug of warm broth. The maid returned with the tray untouched. The lady did not open the door. Daniel told her to leave the tray by the door and leave. In the morning, the tray was empty. The next day, the same thing happened. The tray by the door, empty in the morning. On the 3rd day, Serafina came out. She walked silently down to the dining room. She sat down at the table without a word. She looked at the plate in front of her. Smoked fish, bread, greens. She tasted the fish. Daniel saw her fingers twitch slightly. She ate everything. Then she looked up at him. Her eyes were still cold, but something new had appeared in them. Not warmth, no. More like a question. She asked who had prepared it. Daniel replied that it was Chef Barris. She asked where the fish came from. Daniel explained about the barrels in the basement and the smoking process. He told her that they had been planning to throw this fish away. She was silent for a moment. Then she said the fish was good, and that if they could secure a supply of salt and build a proper smokehouse, they could sell it. 3 crowns a pound in any city market, maybe 4 if marketed as a delicacy from the outskirts. Daniel looked at her. She was sitting there, hungry, angry, unkempt, in a stranger's castle at the edge of the world, and the first thing she saw in that plate of smoked fish was profit margin. He asked if she could look at the records, whatever there are, income, expenses, debts. She replied, "What kind of records does an estate like this have?" He said that was exactly why they needed someone who was good with numbers. She looked at him for a long time. It was the look of someone who was used to being taken advantage of and was trying to figure out when it would start. Daniel added that first he'd like to know how she was feeling. It had been a long drive, and he didn't know if she'd slept well. She blinked. This was clearly not the question she'd been expecting. She replied that she'd slept fine. He nodded. He stood up. He said the records were on the desk in the office when she was ready. Not today, not tomorrow. When she's ready. And he left. He heard Serafina exhale slowly behind him, like someone who'd braced for a blow that never came. On the 7th day, the second one arrived. Ashley Vero, 19 years old. And while Serafina had come by wagon, Ashley had come on foot. Alone, no servants, no trunk, with a sack on her back and a bow slung over her shoulder. Light hair, almost white. A weather-beaten, tanned face with a scar across her left eyebrow. Men's clothing. Boots that were worn, but sturdy. She walked through the gate, and the first thing she did was look around. Not like a guest, like a hunter. She took in the walls, the towers, the corners, the exits, the lines of sight. Daniel recognized that look. It was how his driver, a former Marine, would survey every new parking lot. A professional habit. She looked at him, briefly, appraisingly, and Daniel realized she was assessing whether she could take him down with a single blow. The answer was yes. He asked how she'd gotten there. She replied that she'd been walking for 4 days. He asked why she wasn't using a carriage. She replied that she'd sent the carriage that had been sent for her on her way on the 2nd day, because the coachman was taking the road, whereas the shortcut through the woods was half the distance. He asked if she'd like something to eat. She replied that she wanted to see the room first. Alvin led the way. An hour later, Alvin returned and reported that Lady Vero had inspected the room. She said it was stuffy in there, and she had climbed onto the roof. Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he asked if there was anything on the roof she could sleep on. Alvin replied that there was a platform by the north tower. It was made of stone, with no railing, and exposed to the wind on both sides. Daniel ordered a blanket and a plate of food to be brought there. Alvin asked why the roof. Daniel replied that if she was more comfortable on the roof, then the roof it was. People work better when they sleep where they like. Alvin looked at him as if he'd just said something completely insane, yet utterly reasonable. He took the blanket and the food up there. In the morning, the plate was empty. Ashley was sitting on the edge of the roof with her legs dangling down. A bow lay beside her. She was looking at the forest beyond the castle walls. On the 8th day, Daniel woke up to a sound, a quiet, rhythmic one. He walked over to the window. In the courtyard, in the pre-dawn twilight, Ashley was shooting her bow. Her target was a post in the stable. She was shooting from 30 paces away. Each arrow landed in the palm of the one before it. 10 arrows, 10 hits. She gathered the arrows and started again. Daniel silently went down to the kitchen. He found a pitcher of water and a mug. He went out into the courtyard and set the mug on a stone by the wall. Not right next to her, but 5 paces away, so she could come over and take it whenever she wanted. Or not. She glanced at him. He nodded and went back inside. An hour later, he looked out the window again. The mug was empty. Ashley was still shooting. On the 9th day, 2 people arrived at once. Madeline Uncorvus and Hannah Soyun. They were riding in the same carriage, not out of friendship, but because their routes coincided, and someone in the office decided to save on transportation. Madeline got out first, 26 years old, tall, blonde hair, straight back, the face of a woman who had seen things worse than a cheap castle on the outskirts. She was a widow. Her first husband had died under circumstances that his entire house called suspicious. They couldn't prove it, but his reputation was ruined. She inspected the courtyard, the kitchen, the cellar, the stable, the pantry, the bedrooms, all in 40 minutes. Then she walked over to Daniel and said that the pantry was organized incorrectly, that dry goods shouldn't be stored next to meat, that the kitchen didn't have a proper cutting board, and that the laundry room was a disgrace to any home, including a barn. Daniel listened. He nodded. He took notes. She stopped mid-sentence. She asked why he was taking notes. He replied that it was because she was right on every point and he wanted to fix it. She looked at him for a few seconds. Then she asked where her room was. Hannah was the last to step out of the carriage. Petite, Dark hair, dark skin, quiet. She was carrying 2 bags, one with clothes, the other with herbs and vials. The bag with the herbs was heavier. She didn't ask anything, didn't look around the yard, didn't size up the walls. She looked at the people, at the maid, her hands red from washing clothes in cold water, at the gardener's son, a young boy with an old cut on his leg bandaged with a dirty rag, at Olvin, whose knee clicked as he walked. She walked over to the boy. She crouched down. She unwound the rag. She examined the wound. Silently, she took a glass vial and a clean strip of cloth out of her bag. She rinsed the wound, applied ointment, and rebandaged it. The boy didn't even make a peep. Her hands moved so calmly and confidently that it couldn't possibly have hurt. She stood up. She looked at Daniel. She asked if there was a room in the castle that could be used as an infirmary. He replied that there was a storeroom in the east wing, small but dry. She nodded. That was the extent of their interaction. No questions, no complaints, no explanations. Daniel realized one thing. 4 women had arrived at his castle in 5 days. Not a single one of them cried. Not a single one screamed. Not a single one made a scene. They were all broken, but broken the way strong people are broken. Not into dust, but into sharp shards that cut anyone who tries to pick them up with bare hands. There was one left. Yuna Jiwa arrived on the 10th day, on horseback, alone, on a bay gelding that was clearly a government-issued horse and which she clearly hated. She dismounted in a single motion, tossed the reins to Olvin, and surveyed the courtyard. Short, slender, a short black braid, men's clothing, 2 blades at her belt. Her face was young, but her eyes were old, the eyes of someone accustomed to being ready for a blow. She looked at Daniel. He was standing on the porch. She said nothing. She walked past him. Then she stopped. She turned around. She asked where she could train. He pointed to the backyard, the area in front of the old stable, trodden earth, plenty of space. She nodded and left. By evening, Daniel heard a thudding sound, wooden, rhythmic. Yuna had found an old training post and was practicing her strikes. With 2 blades at once, her speed was such that the blades blurred into streaks. He stood by the window and watched. He saw how the pros moved, not on a screen, in person. One of his managers in Chicago was a former semi-pro boxer. Another practiced kendo. Those people's bodies worked differently. No unnecessary movements, no wasted motion. Yuna moved the same way. Every strike on target, every step precise. Nothing showy. Pure function. He didn't go to her that evening, nor did he go the next morning. He simply carried out a pitcher of water and set it against the wall, just like he did for Ashley, without words, from a distance. She looked at the pitcher, then at the second-floor window where he was no longer to be seen. Then she took a drink and continued her training. Now all 5 were in the castle, and that didn't make the castle any warmer. 10 days until the wedding. Daniel gathered Alvin and Barris in the kitchen. Not the brides. He hadn't bothered them yet. He said the ceremony should be simple. No feasts, no guests. There wouldn't be enough food to put on a show. Alvin objected, saying that according to protocol, they needed at least a wedding dinner. Daniel asked what they had. Alvin listed it. Smoked fish, bread, a little cheese, root vegetables from the cellar. A barrel of sour wine that had been sitting in the cellar for so long that no one remembered who had put it there. Daniel said that would be enough. Barris said that with this selection, he could make something decent if given 2 days. Daniel agreed. 2 days before the wedding, he did something no baron before him had ever done. He went from room to all 5 of them, one by one. He knocked on each door. He told each of them the same thing. The ceremony is in 2 days. He would demand nothing more than what the law requires: a signature, an oath, their presence. After the ceremony, each of them would remain in her own room, with a lock on the door and the key in her possession. He would not come without an invitation, ever. If any of them wanted to leave, now was their last chance. He would not hold them back. He would not pursue them. He would not complain to the crown. Let them take a horse. They now had one, that very same government-issued gelding on which Yuna had arrived. Serafina listened to him as she stood by the window. She didn't turn around. She said she had nowhere to go. Her father had sold her along with his debts. If she returned, he'd sell her again. Ashley was sitting on the roof. She lowered her head as he spoke to her from the bottom of the stairs. She said she didn't care where she lived. At least there's a forest nearby here. Madeline listened to him while sitting on the bed. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her back was straight. She said she'd been married once before and knew what to expect. Then she added that at least he was younger than her last husband and didn't reek of wine first thing in the morning. It was almost a compliment. Hannah opened the door and listened to him while standing in the doorway. Behind her, on the table, were test tubes and bundles of herbs. She'd set up a little lab for herself. She said she'd stay. There are people here who need help. Yuna didn't open the door. She answered from behind it. Her voice was steady and stern. She said she wasn't going to run away. Running away is a disgrace. She would stay. But if he tried to touch her without permission, she would kill him. Daniel replied that he understood. Then he added that dinner would be in an hour and that Barris had prepared something new with root vegetables. It was an invitation, not a demand. That evening, everyone gathered in the dining hall. For the first time, a long table with 6 seats. Daniel sat at the head, not because he wanted to be in charge, but because it was the only place from which he could see everyone, a professional habit. At meetings, he always sat so he could see everyone. Serafina sat on the right, far away, at the other end. Madeline next to her. Hannah in the middle. Yuna by the door. Ashley didn't sit down at all. She stood against the wall, leaning back, and ate standing up. No one was talking. The sound of knives on plates, chewing, silence. Daniel didn't try to speak. He didn't try to joke. He didn't try to lighten the mood. He ate. They ate. That was enough. For the first time. The wedding took place on the 12th day. The priest came from the nearest town, 4 miles away. A small, nervous man with a receding hairline and a habit of rubbing his hands together. He clearly didn't understand what was going on. 5 brides and 1 groom? He asked twice if this was a royal decree. Alvin showed him the scroll bearing the royal seal. The priest recited the ceremony 6 times, 1 general one and 5 separate ones. Each of the wives took her vows. Their voices were different. Serafina spoke evenly and coldly, as if she were reading a commercial contract. Madeline spoke quietly but clearly, the words of a woman who already knows that vows mean little. Hannah spoke barely audibly. Ashley spoke quickly, as if she wanted to finish as soon as possible. Yuna spoke through clenched teeth. Daniel recited his part 5 times, each time exactly the same, calmly, without fanfare, without a tremor. He looked each of them in the eye as he spoke, not defiantly, just directly, like a man who keeps his word and wants it to be clear. After the ceremony, there was dinner. Barris outdid himself. From root vegetables, smoked fish, and sour wine, he created something. A thick soup with herbs that Hannah had found in the castle's surroundings. The fish was served on wooden boards with greens. The bread was fresh. The wine turned out to be not as sour as expected. 6 people at the table. The priest had left. The servants stood in the doorway. Silence. Daniel raised his mug. He said he wouldn't make any speeches, that none of them were here of their own free will, and he understood that. That the only thing he could promise was that in this house, each of them would be safe, that her word would carry weight, that her door would lock from the inside. He said he didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that right now there was food on the table, a fire in the fireplace, a roof over their heads, and that this was the beginning. He drank. The 5 women sat in silence. Then Madeline raised her mug. She drank in silence. Hannah raised hers. After a pause, Serafina did the same. Ashley raised hers without looking at anyone. Yuna was the last to raise hers, in one sharp motion, as if she were raising a blade. No one smiled, no one cried, but they all drank. It was the quietest wedding in the history of the Kingdom of Ertan. 6 strangers at the table. No music, no dancing, no guests. With smoked fish instead of roast meat and sour wine instead of honey. That night, Daniel lay in his room and stared at the ceiling. That very one, with a crack, with a spider web. 5 wives, all behind closed doors, all in a stranger's house, all in a stranger's life. He thought that a new employee's first day is always the hardest, not because the work is hard, but because nothing is his own. The chair belongs to someone else. The people are strangers. The coffee machine is a mystery, and you sit there thinking you made a mistake. The trick is to make it through to the 2nd week. It gets easier in the 2nd week, always. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow would be the 2nd day, and he had to make sure that the 5 women behind 5 closed doors would have a reason to open them in the morning. The morning after the wedding began with a scream. Daniel jolted upright in bed, and for the first 3 seconds couldn't figure out where he was. Then he remembered. A stranger's body, a stranger's world. Yesterday was the wedding. The scream was coming from the yard. He pulled on his boots and ran out. In the yard stood Madeline and one of the stable hands. The stable hand was red-faced and angry. Madeline was calm and cold. A dead chicken lay between them. Madeline said the chicken had died because the chicken coop hadn't been cleaned in 3 weeks and that it was a disgrace and sloppiness. The stable hand replied that he was a stable hand, not a poultry keeper, that he already had enough to do, and that he hadn't been hired to listen to some stray woman. At the word stray, Madeline fell silent. Her expression didn't change, but Daniel saw her knuckles turn white. He walked over. He stood beside her. He looked at the stable hand. He asked his name. The stable hand said his name was Garth. Daniel asked Garth how long he'd been working at the castle. Garth replied, 12 years. Daniel asked who was in charge of the birds. Garth hesitated. He said that the old gardener's wife used to take care of it, but she died last year, and since then, no one really has. Daniel nodded. He turned to Madeline. He said that Lady Corvus was right. The chicken coop needs to be cleaned. But Garth is right too. It's not his responsibility, and it's unfair to dump someone else's work on him. Then he looked at both of them and said they needed someone to be in charge of the chickens, and that he'd be grateful if Lady Corvus could help draw up a list of what the estate actually needs, and who's responsible for what. Because right now, no one is in charge, and that's why the chickens are dying. Madeline looked at him. Garth looked at him. Daniel looked at the dead chicken. Then he told Barris to take the chicken to the kitchen before it went bad. Soup for dinner. Barris took it. Madeline turned and went back into the castle. An hour later, she returned, with a parchment. It contained a list, 23 items, everything that was wrong with the estate, with the names of those responsible and where they were, and with blank spaces where they were missing. There were 17 blank spaces. Daniel read the list. Then he looked at Madeline and said it was the best audit he'd ever seen in his life. She didn't know the word audit. He explained it to her. She snorted, but the corner of her mouth twitched. It was the first time any of his wives had ever made anything resembling a smile. By lunchtime on the second day, Daniel had unfolded a large sheet of parchment on the kitchen table. On it, he drew what he had called an org chart back in Chicago. Circles with names, lines connecting them, who reports to whom, who is responsible for what. At the top, he wrote Westerlin. Lines extended downward from that circle. Farming, hunting, health, security, trade. For now, the space under each word was blank. Alvin looked at the parchment and asked what kind of magic circle this was. Daniel replied that it was an organizational chart. Who does what? Alvin said that on a normal estate, the Baron decides everything himself. Daniel replied that he wasn't a normal Baron. That was true in several senses at once. He hung the parchment on the wall in the dining hall, where everyone could see it. He didn't fill in the circles himself. He wanted each of the 5 to see for herself where she belonged, or not to see it, or to refuse. It was a risk. But Daniel knew one thing from his 8 years of rule. Assigned responsibility works at half the rate. Chosen responsibility works twice as well. Madeline was the first to approach the parchment, that same evening. She stood there and looked at it. Then she picked up a quill from the table and wrote her name under the word household. In the morning, Daniel saw that Hannah's name had appeared under the word health. The handwriting was neat and small. She had written it at night when no one was around. Ashley hadn't written anything. On the third day, Daniel found not a name, but an arrow in the hunting circle, a small, drawn arrow. He smiled. On the fourth day, Seraphina approached the parchment in front of everyone during breakfast. Silently, she picked up a quill and wrote her name under trade. Then she looked at Daniel and said that she already had 3 ideas and that she needed access to all the estate's income records for the past 5 years. Daniel replied that there were no records for 5 years. There were his notes from the past 2 weeks. Seraphina closed her eyes for a second. She opened them. She said she'd start from scratch. Una didn't touch the parchment. 5 days. She trained, she ate. She trained, she slept. She spoke only when asked. On the 6th day after the wedding, Daniel went out into the courtyard at dawn. Una was there, as always. 2 blades, a post. Strikes. He sat down on a rock 10 paces away from her, in silence. She continued. After 10 minutes, she stopped. She looked at him. She asked what he wanted. He replied that he wanted to ask a question. She waited. He asked how many people she could train in a month. She blinked. She had clearly been expecting a different question. She asked what she was supposed to teach them. He replied, the basics, how to hold a weapon, how to stand in formation, not to run away when they're scared. She asked why. He replied that the castle had no guards, not a single person. There were walls, there were gates, but behind them, no one. Any squad of 10 men could take Westerlin in half an hour. She was silent. Then she asked who he planned to recruit for the guard. He replied that he'd recruit from those who were already there, the stable hands, the gardener, his son, villagers, anyone who wants to. She said that was ridiculous. "You can't turn peasants into warriors." He replied that he didn't need warriors. He needed people who could hold out on the wall for half an hour until help arrived, or until she arrived. She looked at him for a long time. Something was changing in her eyes. Not warmth, not trust, more like interest, like that of a master who'd been offered a challenge instead of an exam. She asked if it would be public. He didn't understand. She explained. Would he announce to everyone that a woman was in command of the castle guard, or would it be kept secret? As always, just as her father had done. Train your son in secret. Prepare your troops in secret. Be strong, but invisible. Daniel stood up. He said he would make the announcement tonight at dinner, in front of everyone, that Lady Yuna Jiwa was being appointed head of the Westerland Castle Guard, and if anyone disagreed, they should tell him personally. Yuna stood motionless. Then she nodded briefly. She turned away and began practicing her strikes again. But Daniel noticed her hands were trembling, not from fatigue. That evening, he made the announcement, just as he'd promised, at the table, in front of everyone. Ulvin choked. Garth opened his mouth and closed it. Madeline raised an eyebrow. Serafina said nothing, but Daniel saw that she looked at Yuna and tilted her head slightly, an acknowledgement from one woman who had been used to another. Yuna sat upright, her face stony, but under the table, her fingers dug into the edge of the bench until they turned white. That evening, a name appeared on the parchment in the dining hall under the word defense. Yuna Jiwa. The handwriting was firm, sharp, like the strike of a blade. 5 circles, 5 names. A structure. Daniel stood before the parchment and looked at it. It wasn't a plan, it was a promise. Each of them had written her own name there, not because he had ordered it, but because she had seen a place that made sense, a place where her skills were needed, a place where she wasn't astray, wasn't tainted, and not wild, not a poisoner, and not an unwanted daughter. He thought that in Chicago they called this onboarding, the orientation period, the first 2 weeks at a new job, when a person decides whether to stay or leave. He looked at the 5 names on the wall. So far, they were all still there. It was the 3rd week after the wedding. Serafina sat at a table in the office she'd taken for herself without asking. It used to be a storage room for old saddles. Now the saddles stood in the corner, and parchments covered with numbers lay on the table. Serafina was counting. Westerland had 3 sources of income. Peasant taxes, a pittance. The village 2 miles from the castle paid in kind. Grain, eggs, and sometimes meat, hunting trophies, though these were irregular. Ashley had started going out into the woods and bringing back game, but that fed the castle rather than bringing in money. Smoked fish was the only real commodity, the 4 barrels Daniel had salvaged during the first week. Serafina did the math. At their current rate of spending, the castle could last 6 weeks, maybe 7 if they cut back on portions. The quarterly tax to the crown amounted to 80 silver crowns. They had 11. She went to see Daniel. She laid the parchment with the figures in front of him. She told him they were bankrupt, that the tax was due in 2 months, that they had no money, that if they didn't pay, the crown had the right to confiscate their lands. Daniel read the figures. Then he asked how much smoked fish cost in the nearest town. Serafina replied that she didn't know. She'd been here for 3 weeks and hadn't been to town. Daniel said they needed to find out, and that he'd like her to go to town and find out. Not just the price of fish, the prices of everything. What's being sold? What's being bought? What's in short supply? Who's trading? Who's in charge at the market? Serafina said they had 1 horse and a cart without a sideboard. Daniel replied that Garth would fix the side of the wagon, and that while they only had 1 horse, it was alive. Serafina was silent for a moment. Then she asked why she had to go herself. They could send Ulvin. Daniel replied that Ulvin was honest and reliable, but he wouldn't see what she would see. Ulvin would see prices. She would see opportunities. It was the first time he told her outright that she was smarter than others, not as a compliment, as a fact, like a working tool. You see what others don't. That's your strength. Use it. Serafina left the next morning. She took her maid and Alvin with her for safety. She returned 2 days later. That evening, she laid out her notes on the table in the dining room. Daniel called everyone in. All 5 wives were at the table, plus Ulvin and Barris. For the first time, it felt less like dinner and more like a meeting. Serafina spoke. The rest listened. The town was called Redmark, 4 miles to the south, 3,000 residents. 1 market, 2 taverns, a merchant's guild that controlled all trade. Fish prices. Salted fish, 2 copper auras per pound. Smoked fish isn't sold there. At all. Serafina said this and fell silent. Daniel saw Madeline's eyebrow twitch. Serafina continued. Smoked fish in Redmark is a delicacy brought in from the coast. Once every 2 months, 4 silver crowns per pound, and it sells out in a day. She did the math. If Barris can smoke 10 pounds a week, if salt can be bought from coastal merchants at a reasonable price, if they can set up a fishing operation on the river 3 miles to the east, then Westerland could earn 40 crowns a month from fish alone. That would cover the tax and leave some to spare. Daniel looked at her, then at the others. Madeline said the smokehouse needed to be expanded, that she knew how to organize the work. They needed extra hands. Daniel asked Ashley if she could catch fish. Ashley looked at him as if he'd asked whether a bird could fly. She said the river to the east was full of trout. She'd seen them on her way to the castle. Hannah said smoked fish keeps longer if you add juniper. She had some in stock. Una said nothing. But when Serafina mentioned that the road to the city passed through a grove where a trade caravan had been robbed a month ago, Una nodded briefly. That meant the fish caravan would be under guard. Daniel sat and listened. He said almost nothing during the entire meeting. He asked 3 questions and made 1 note. They did the rest. 5 women, each in her own field. Each saw her part of the task. Together, in 20 minutes, they put together a plan that would have taken him a week to devise on his own. That was exactly what he wanted. It wasn't up to him to be smart. He had to gather smart people around one table and ask the right question. After the meeting, Serafina lingered. The others had left. She stood by the table, folding her parchments. Daniel was folding his. Without looking at him, she asked where he'd learned to run a meeting like that. He replied, "At work." She asked, "What kind of work?" He replied that he managed people, delivery and warehouses, 30 people. She looked at him and asked, "Here in Ertan?" He paused, then said, "A long time ago, in another life." She didn't ask any further, but he could tell she'd taken it to heart. 3 days later, the work began. Madeline took charge of renovating the smokehouse. She found a carpenter among the villagers named Thomas, an old man in his 50s with huge hands and a habit of grumbling, but he worked quickly. In a week, the old shed was transformed into a functional space. Not pretty, but functional. 2 smoking chambers instead of 1, a vent made from a stone pipe, racks for the fish. Barris spent the first 2 days right by the chambers, never leaving their side. He adjusted the temperature. He tried different types of wood. Alder gave the best results. Applewood wasn't bad either. Oak left too heavy an aftertaste. He found his own recipe, alder with a touch of juniper, just as Hannah had suggested. The fish turned out golden with a delicate aroma and kept twice as long as usual. Ashley started catching fish. Not alone. She found 2 brothers in the village who knew the river. The guys were young and strong, but terrified of the forest beyond the river because bone wolves roamed there. Ashley told them she'd take care of the wolves. They believed her. Something in her eyes told them that this girl with white hair and a scar across her eyebrow wasn't joking. Her first catch was 20 pounds of trout. Ashley carried the fish in a sack on her back and dumped it on the table in front of Barris. Barris looked at the fish, at Ashley, and for the first time in all the time Daniel had known him, Barris smiled. The smoking process took 2 days, 10 pounds of finished fish. Serafina packed the goods. She didn't just toss them into a bag. She wrapped each fish in clean canvas, tied it with twine. She attached a small piece of parchment labeled Westerland Smokehouse. Daniel asked why. Serafina replied that people pay more for something that has a name. He thought that in Chicago this was called branding, and that Serafina had invented it on her own, without knowing a single word or concept of it. The first trip to Redmark with the goods, Serafina rode alone. Una rode alongside her, on horseback, with 2 blades at her belt. Her face was such that no bandit in his right mind would come closer than an arrow's flight. They returned by evening. Serafina placed a small bag on the table in front of Daniel. He untied it. Inside were coins, silver ones, 32 crowns, for 10 pounds of smoked fish. Daniel looked at her. She allowed herself the smallest possible smile. The corner of her mouth turned up just 3 millimeters, but her eyes sparkled. She said she hadn't sold it all. She'd set aside 2 pounds as samples for the innkeeper, who wanted to buy from her regularly. If his customers liked the fish, he was willing to take 20 pounds a month at a fixed price, 3 crowns per pound. She also learned that there's a salt merchant in Redmark, an old man named Morin. He sells salt at an inflated price because he's the only supplier. But Serafina spoke with him. She didn't haggle. She asked what he was lacking. It turned out that the old man didn't need money. He needed honey. His wife brews mead, and honey is in short supply right now because the main apiary, a 2-day journey away, burned down this past summer. Serafina asked Daniel if there were any apiaries nearby. He didn't know, but Ashley knew. There were wild hives in the forest, an hour and a half's walk away. 3 of them. She'd seen them when she went hunting. Serafina said that if they could get honey, they could trade it for salt. No money, barter. Honey for salt, salt for fish, fish for crowns, crowns for taxes. Daniel sat and listened. A chain formed in his mind, one that in Chicago they would call a supply chain. Catch, processing, smoking, packaging, delivery, sale. Reverse logistics in the form of salt. It's a closed loop. It all works. And all of this in 3 weeks. He looked at the 5 women at the table. Each had done her part. Ashley caught the fish, Barris smoked it, Hannah provided the recipe with juniper, Madeline built the smokehouse, Serafina sold it and found a supply channel for the salt, Una ensured the safety of the route. He hadn't done anything. He asked a question, and they answered, each in her own way. He thought that this was why he loved his job. Not for the reports, not for the meetings, for the moment when the machine starts running, when every cog is in its place and you hear everything humming quietly. Westerland was starting to hum, quietly, barely audible, but it was humming. The next day, something happened that he hadn't expected. In the morning, he went down to the dining hall and found Hannah sitting at the table, alone. A cup of herbal tea stood in front of her. She looked as if she hadn't slept all night. He asked what had happened. She replied that 3 children in the village had fallen ill. A fever, a cough. She'd gone to see them during the night, gave them some herbs. Now she was waiting. If the fever didn't break by evening, it wasn't just a cold, and she'd need more remedies than she had in her bag. Daniel sat down next to her. He asked what she needed. She listed the items: white willow bark, eleuthero root, dried mint, honey for the mixture, hot water, plenty of clean cloth for compresses. He asked where to get these things. Willow bark is by the river. Eleuthero grows on the southern slope of the hill beyond the village. She's run out of mint. They don't have any honey yet, but Ashley knows where the wild hives are. He stood up. Within an hour, he had organized the following. He sent Olvina to the river for the bark. He sent the young gardener to the southern slope with a description of the plant that Hannah had drawn on a scrap of paper. Ashley went to the wild beehives and returned 3 hours later with a clay pot of honey and 4 stings on her hands. Without being asked, Madeline cut clean cloth from an old sheet and boiled some water. By noon, Hannah had everything she needed. She mixed the decoction and took it to the village. By evening, the fever had subsided in 2 of them. The 3rd child was worse off. Hannah stayed with him for the night. Daniel arrived in the village at midnight. He found the house, small, made of mud brick. Inside, a boy of about 5 lay on a bench. His mother sat beside him, her face that of someone who had been praying so long that she had already forgotten the words. Hannah sat on the floor next to the child. She was changing his compresses, feeding him the herbal tea by the spoonful. She didn't look up when Daniel entered. He didn't want to disturb her. He sat down by the wall and simply stayed there, in silence. If she needed anything, he would hand it to her. If not, he'd just sit there. Toward morning, the fever began to subside. The boy's breathing evened out. The mother began to cry, quietly, soundlessly, just tears streaming down her face. Hannah stood up, her legs buckled, and Daniel caught her by the elbow. She looked at him with eyes clouded by exhaustion. He led her to the castle. She walked, holding onto his hand, not because she wanted to, but because otherwise she would have fallen. Inside the castle, he led her into a room. Madeline was there, standing with a bowl of soup in her hands. Hot soup. She'd been cooking it all night, just in case. Hannah sat down on the bed. Madeline set the soup in front of her. Daniel brought a blanket. Hannah asked why he had come to the village. What could he have done? He replied that he couldn't do anything, but someone has to be there for the one who saves others. That's true. She looked at him, then at Madeline, then into the bowl of soup, and she began to eat. In the morning, Daniel stepped out into the hallway. Serafina was sitting against the wall in the hallway, on the floor, her legs stretched out, her head tilted back. She was asleep. Ashley was sitting next to her. She wasn't asleep. She was staring at the wall. Una was standing at the end of the hallway, leaning against the wall. Her arms were crossed. Her eyes were closed, but Daniel knew she wasn't asleep. All 4 of them were here, all night long. No one had asked them to be here. No one had called them. They had simply come and waited for Hannah to return. Daniel stood there and looked at them, at the 4 women in the hallway of the old castle, strangers to one another, bound by a decree none of them wanted, and who, that night, without a single word, stood side by side because one of them was in danger. Not in physical danger, in the kind of danger where a person gives everything and leaves nothing for themselves. They saw it, and they came. He thought that a team isn't just when people work together. A team is when people stay awake together. He walked past them quietly. He went down to the kitchen. He lit a fire. He put water on to boil, and he began to cook breakfast for 6. The first breakfast he'd ever cooked by himself in this world. A month had passed. Westerland had changed. Not on the outside. The walls were still gray. The roof in the west wing was still leaking. The courtyard was still cracked. But a rhythm had emerged inside the castle. The morning began with Una. She would go out into the courtyard before dawn and train. 5 others now followed her. Garth, Tim, the gardener's son, and 2 village lads whom Una had handpicked herself. And old Olvin. Olvin couldn't hold a sword. He was 63, and his knees creaked with every step.
But he stood in formation and held a shield, a wooden one, cobbled together from a barrel lid. Una didn't push him. She saw in him what a good commander sees. A man who wouldn't abandon the ranks, even when his body could no longer keep up. People like that keep those who are younger and stronger by their side, not through skill, but by example. After training, breakfast. Barris had learned to cook for a large group. Porridge, bread, eggs if there were any, thinly sliced smoked fish, a broth that Hana prepared every morning from whatever grew around the castle. All 6 of them sat at the table that morning, Daniel at the head, his 5 wives on either side, in silence. Occasionally, someone would say something to the point. Serafina reported on prices, Madeline on the household. Ashley briefly mentioned what she'd seen in the forest. But more often than not, they were silent. It wasn't a hostile silence. It was the silence of people getting used to one another. After breakfast, each went about her business. Serafina went to the office with the saddles. Madeline went around the castle and the village. Hana went to her herb room, which now took up an entire room. Ashley went into the forest. Una went to the training ground. Daniel moved among them, not as a boss, but as a liaison. In the morning, he checked Madeline's list and discussed priorities. Then he went to Serafina and listened to her calculations. Then to Hana to see if she needed anything. Then out to the courtyard to see how Una's training was going. Then to the gate to meet Ashley if she was returning from the woods. He didn't do the work. He made sure the work got done. In the 5th week after the wedding, the first encounter with the outside world occurred. A horseman rode through the castle gates. A fine horse. Fine clothes. On his cloak was a coat of arms with crossed axes. Baron Gilmore Toll, a neighbor from the southwest, the owner of lands 3 times the size of Westerland's, a hunter, a drunkard, a man with a habit of speaking loudly and listening quietly, that is, never. He arrived unannounced. With him were 2 servants and the air of a man who'd stopped by to check out a new toy. Daniel met him in the courtyard. Toll dismounted. He looked down at Daniel from above. Toll was a burly man with a red face and hands that had known both an axe and a goblet. He said he'd come to congratulate him on his marriage, and to see the man to whom the crown had given 5 wives. He pronounced the word given in such a way that it was clear he meant something else. Daniel invited him inside, seated him at the table. Barris served the meal. Toll ate and looked around. His eyes were small and quick. He saw everything. The peeling walls, the old furniture, the empty stable, the cracks in the ceiling. He saw it all and committed it to memory. Between bites of bread, he brought up the matter. He said that the land was east of the river, the very same river where Ashley used to fish. This land is disputed. His house believes it has belonged to the Tolls for 3 generations. The maps are unclear. The boundaries are blurred. But now that Westerland is showing signs of life, he would like to set the record straight. In his understanding, setting the record straight meant that Daniel would hand over the land, just like that, as a good neighbor. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't nod. He didn't frown. He just listened. When Toll finished, Daniel asked why he wanted this land. Toll blinked. No one had ever asked him why. Everyone asked how much. How much would you sell it for? How much would you give it up for? Why? That was a question people around here didn't ask. Toll said that land was land. It belonged to the strong. Daniel asked what he would do with it. Toll said he would hunt. There are deer in the forest by the river. Good trophies. Daniel nodded. He asked if Toll sold venison. Toll snorted. He said he wasn't a merchant. He was a nobleman. He hunted for the table, not for the market. Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he made the following proposal. The land remains disputed. So be it. But Toll can hunt in the forest by the river whenever he wants, freely, without restrictions. In return, half the catch goes to Westerland. Meat for the castle, hides for sale. Toll hunts for pleasure. Westerland gets the meat. Everyone's happy. Toll looked at him. Something stirred in his small eyes. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that, without threats, without concessions, with an offer that gave him what he wanted without him losing anything. He asked what would happen if he simply took the land. He had more men. He had more swords. Daniel replied calmly. He said he could. But then, Toll would end up with an empty forest and an enemy at the border. Whereas now, he could have a forest full of trees and a neighbor who sold smoked fish at a discount. Toll burst out laughing, loudly, loud enough for the whole hall to hear. He said that Daniel was either the smartest baron he'd ever seen or the craziest. Then he stood up, shook his hand, and left. Without signing anything, but without taking the land either. When the gates closed behind him, Serafina stepped out from behind the column. She had been standing there the whole time, listening. Daniel knew. He'd seen the edge of her sleeve during the first 5 minutes of the conversation. She said he was taking a risk, that Toll would return, that people like him only understood force. Daniel replied that Toll understood profit. He just didn't know it. He was used to thinking he wanted the land. In reality, he wanted to hunt. And if you give him a hunt without a war, he'll take it. Because war is expensive, and hunting is free. Serafina looked at him. Then she said she needed to recalculate the value of the deer hides on the Red Mark market, and she left. Daniel smirked. She was already calculating the profits from a deal that didn't even exist yet. That was a good sign. 3 days, Toll sent a messenger. A short letter. He accepts the offer. For now, he'll give it a try. If he's deceived, he'll send not a messenger, but 20 swordsmen. Daniel showed the letter to Yuna. Yuna read it. Then she said that 20 swordsmen for Toll is his entire garrison. He wouldn't leave his estate empty just to attack Westerland. It was a bluff. But just in case, she would double the night watch. Daniel nodded. A week later, Toll arrived for a hunt, with 3 hounds and 2 servants. He left with a deer and in good spirits. He left half the carcass, as agreed. Barris butchered the deer. That evening, the smell of roasted venison filled the castle for the first time. All 6 of them sat at the table and ate meat they hadn't seen here in months. Madeline said the meat was excellent. Ashley said the deer was old and that the young ones in that forest were fatter. Yuna ate in silence but went back for seconds. Twice. Hana asked for the bones, for broth. The sick people in the village needed broth. Serafina ate and took notes. She was already calculating how many hides they could sell by the end of the month. Daniel watched them. 6 weeks ago, 6 strangers had sat at this table. Now, they were still strangers. But they were eating at the same table, working under the same roof. And every day, the distance between them was shrinking. By a millimeter, but it was shrinking. He thought there was a phase in leadership that couldn't be rushed. Formation. When a group of people becomes a team. It doesn't happen on command. It happens when people share a table, share the risk, share the silence. And one morning they wake up and realize they care whether the person in the next room got a good night's sleep. Westerland was in that phase. Not a team yet, but no longer just 6 random people. Winter arrived in the 7th week. Not a mild one, as Alvin had hoped. A real one. The north wind carried snow that stung their faces and seeped into every crack in the castle. The temperature plummeted overnight. In the morning, Daniel woke up from the cold. His blanket was covered in frost. He exhaled and saw his breath. The first problem became obvious that very hour. The roof of the west wing, the very one that had been leaking. Now it wasn't leaking. It was letting snow in, whole layers of it. The rooms below it were now unusable. 3 rooms, the pantry with the grain, the servants' quarters, and the old library, which had no books, but did have shelves where Madeline stored her fabric supplies. Madeline was the first to discover it. She came to Daniel with the look of someone ready to kill someone, but who hadn't yet decided whom. The fabric was soaked. Not all of it, but a third. The grain in the pantry had to be moved immediately, or it would rot. Daniel stood up. His head was throbbing from the cold. His 20-year-old body was freezing as if he were 80. He put on everything he could find. 2 layers. 3. He went downstairs. In the hallway, he ran into Hana. She was carrying an armful of dried herbs from her room. She said it was cold in the herb room and that some of the mixtures would freeze if they weren't moved. Daniel gathered everyone together. Morning briefing. The first real crisis meeting. 6 people at the table, plus Alvin and Barris. Daniel began with a question. What do we have? Alvin listed it off. Firewood. Enough for 3 weeks if we use it sparingly. Food. Flour for 10 days. Smoked fish for a week. Root vegetables. Meat from Toll's last hunt. Water. The well in the yard is frozen. The stream is still flowing, but the path to it is icy. Daniel asked what we needed. Madeline answered first. Fix the roof, or at least patch the holes. Move the grain to a dry place. Dry the cloth. Insulate the living quarters. Hana said we need supplies for the sick. Winter means colds. Colds mean fever. Fever without treatment means death, especially for children and the elderly.
Una said that night watch on the walls is impossible in such freezing weather. A person will freeze to death in 2 hours. We need shelters on the walls or an hourly shift change. Ashley said that hunting in the forest is different in winter. The game goes deeper into the woods. The trails are covered in snow, but tracks are more visible in the snow. She'll be able to hunt, but she'll need snowshoes. Serafina said that the road to Redmark would be impassable after a heavy snowfall. Trade would come to a standstill. They'd need a stockpile of goods to sell everything at once when the road reopens. Daniel listened.
He took notes. Then he asked his third question. Who would do it?
Madeline said she'd take care of the roof. Thomas, the carpenter, and Garth. They won't be able to properly repair the roof this winter, but they'll patch the holes with boards and oiled cloth. Temporarily. It'll hold until spring. Hannah said she needed a day to gather winter herbs before the snow covered everything. She knows what grows under the snow. Roots, bark, winter rose hips. Una said she'd build shelters on the walls herself, out of old planks and straw. 2 shelters on the north and east walls. That'll be enough for the guards on duty. Ashley said she'd make snowshoes out of willow twigs. She knows how. And she'll make not just 1 pair, but 4. For herself, for her brothers who are fishermen, and 1 spare pair. Serafina said she'd take inventory and draw up a monthly spending plan, with exact figures for each day. Daniel nodded. Then he assigned tasks. Olvin is helping Madeline with the roof. Barris is moving grain from the west storeroom to the cellar next to the kitchen. Tim, the gardener, is clearing the path to the stream and keeping an eye on the ice. Daniel would take care of the firewood himself.
Madeline said it wasn't fitting for a baron to chop wood.
Daniel replied that it was even less fitting for a baron to freeze to death. He grabbed an axe and went outside. His body was weak. His arms were thin. His first swing at the log was so pitiful that Garth turned away to keep from laughing. The 10th was better. The 20th was almost normal. By noon, his shoulders and back ached, and the palms of his hands were scraped raw. But in the courtyard stood a woodpile half his height. Hannah came to him that evening. Silently, she took his hands. She examined them. She shook her head. She rubbed ointment on them. She bandaged them with a clean cloth. She asked why he'd done it himself. There were other people, after all. He replied that everyone was busy with their own affairs and that his hands would heal, but the firewood was needed now. She said he'd get calluses. He replied that calluses were better than frostbite. She almost smiled. Almost. 2 days of work. The roof was covered. Not repaired, but simply covered. Boards and oiled cloth. Madeline inspected the result and said it was a disgrace for any decent house. Then she added that it was a disgrace, but dry and warm.
And that they'd fix it properly in the spring.
The grain has been moved. The cellar next to the kitchen is dry and cold. Perfect for storage. Barris laid out the sacks in neat rows and counted them. There's enough flour to last 14 days, if they bake bread every other day instead of every day. Serafina drew up a plan, a precise one, with figures broken down by day. How much flour, how much fish, how much meat, and how much firewood. She divided the supplies into categories: essentials, desirable, luxuries. Lamp oil turned out to be a luxury. Candles were cheaper. She cut the oil supply in half. Daniel looked at the plan. He asked why she hadn't cut back on food for the servants. Serafina replied that a hungry worker is a bad worker. She'd known this since she was 16, when she'd pulled her father's company out of bankruptcy for the first time. He nodded. She was right. That's exactly how it was. A hungry worker is a bad worker, an axiom from the first chapter of any management textbook. Serafina had come up with it herself at 16. On the 4th day of winter, Ashley went out hunting, with snowshoes, alone. She returned at sunset. She was dragging a roe deer on her back. 70 pounds of meat. She dropped the carcass by the kitchen door and told Barris there were more in the woods, a herd of 5, a 2-hour walk to the northwest. If she went every 3 days, she could take one at a time, and the herd wouldn't scatter. Barris looked at the carcass, then at Ashley. Small, white hair, snow in her hair, a scar across her eyebrow. She'd been dragging a carcass heavier than herself on her back for 4 hours through the snow. He said Lady Vera was the best hunter he'd ever seen. Ashley shrugged. She wasn't used to praise. It embarrassed her more than the cold. That evening at dinner, there was meat, a hot roast. Barris added root vegetables and Hannah's herbs. The aroma was so strong that even Una, who usually ate quickly and sat in silence, sat slowly and chewed with her eyes closed. Daniel looked at them, at the 6 plates of hot meat, at the fire in the fireplace, at the walls that didn't leak, at the people who had each done their part today and together had prevented winter from destroying this house. He thought that a crisis was a strange thing. It breaks weak teams and brings strong ones together. They would survive this winter. He knew it. Not because he believed in miracles, but because sitting at the table were 5 women, each of whom was the best at what she did, and each of them was finally beginning to realize it. The next day, people arrived at the castle gates. 3 of them, a man, a woman, a child of about 7, ragged, hungry, frozen. The man said they were from a village 2 days' journey to the east. The village had been burned down by mercenaries marching south. They'd been walking for 4 days and had been told that food was being given out in Westerland. Daniel asked who had told them that. The man replied that it was a peasant woman from the village below the castle, the very same woman for whom Hannah had delivered a baby. Daniel stood at the gate and looked at the 3 people in the snow. Olvin stood behind him. Olvin said nothing, but Daniel knew what he was thinking. 3 extra mouths to feed, when there wasn't even enough to feed his own. Daniel let them in. He sat them down by the fire. Barris brought soup. Hannah examined the child. A cold and exhaustion. Nothing that couldn't be cured with warmth and food.
Madeline found a room for them, the very one where they used to store the saddles until Serafina took it over as her office. The saddles were moved to the stable. The family moved into the room. Serafina came to see Daniel that evening. She said that, according to her calculations, 3 extra mouths to feed would deplete their supplies by 4 days. That was critical. Daniel replied that the man was healthy and able to work, so it wasn't 3 mouths to feed, but 2 dependents and 1 worker. He asked what the man did for a living. It turned out he was a blacksmith. Not a great master, but a skilled craftsman. Horseshoes, knives, nails, tools, everything that Westerland had been buying in Redmark at triple the price. Serafina fell silent. Then she took out her parchment and began to recalculate. 10 minutes later, she looked up. She said that if the blacksmith made his own nails and staples, Westerland would save 12 crowns a month on iron alone. And if he forged knives to sell, he'd earn even more. Daniel nodded. He hadn't known the refugee would turn out to be a blacksmith. It was a stroke of luck. But luck comes to those who open the gates. The blacksmith's name was Roderick, a quiet man with scorched hands and a habit of speaking only when asked. His wife's name was Mira. Their child was named Nell. Within a week, Roderick was already at work. Madeline had found an old smithy in the castle. Not even a smithy, really, just a shed with a hearth and an anvil that had last been used during the reign of the previous baron's father. The anvil was rusty but intact. The hearth was cracked, but Roderick rebuilt it in 2 days. The bellows were leaky. Roderick patched them with a leather patch. On the 3rd day, the first blow of the hammer rang out from the smithy, and Daniel thought that sound was more beautiful than any music. The first nails. Rough, a little crooked, but nails nonetheless. Madeline took them all. She needed 40 of them to repair the shelves in the pantry. Roderick made 60 in a day. Then the knives. 2 kitchen knives for Barris, 1 hunting knife for Ashley. Ashley came to pick up the knife and examined it in silence. She turned it over in her hands. She checked the balance. Then she looked at Roderick and nodded briefly. For Ashley, that was like a standing ovation. Meanwhile, Serafina did the math. Knives in Redmark cost between 2 and 5 crowns apiece. Roderick could make 3 knives a week in addition to household needs. That's 12 crowns a month. Together with the smoked fish and hides, Westerland's income came to 60 kroner a month. The quarterly tax was 80. For the first time, the numbers added up. Serafina showed Daniel the parchment with the calculations. He read it. Then he looked at her and said that this was Westerland's first budget in history. She asked what a budget was. He explained. A plan of income and expenses for a given period. She said it was just common sense. He replied that on most estates, common sense was out of fashion. In the 8th week after the wedding, something happened that Daniel hadn't planned for. He woke up in the middle of the night to a sound. Not a scream, not a knock. Laughter. Quiet laughter, coming from the kitchen. He went downstairs. A candle was burning in the kitchen. Madeline and Hannah were sitting at the table. Between them stood a bowl containing something. Madeline was eating and covering her mouth with her hand to keep from laughing out loud. Hannah sat with a completely serious expression, which made the situation even funnier. Daniel stopped in the doorway. Madeline saw him and froze, like someone caught doing something forbidden. He asked what was in the bowl. Hannah replied that it was dessert. She tried to make honey-coated nuts using a recipe she remembered from her childhood, but she'd mixed up the proportions and added too much pepper. Madeline tasted it first, and the look on her face made Hannah laugh for the first time since arriving at the castle. Daniel sat down at the table. He picked up a nut, put it in his mouth. He chewed. His eyes watered. His throat burned. He chewed in silence, staring at the wall with the expression of a man accepting his fate. Madeline couldn't help herself and laughed.
for real, not politely, not restrained. The full-throated laughter of a woman who had long forgotten how to do it. Hannah smiled, quietly, a little guiltily, but she smiled. Daniel swallowed. He drank a mug of water. He said the nuts needed some tweaking, but the idea was good. If they replaced the pepper with ginger and added a pinch of salt, it would make a great appetizer to go with wine, one they could sell.
Serafina would have appreciated it. Madeline snorted and said he turned everything into a product. He replied that it was a habit. The three of them sat in the kitchen, and it was the first time the wall between them had grown thinner, not because of work or a crisis, but because of a peppery nut at midnight. A small thing, but Daniel knew that teams aren't built on great feats. They're built on the little things, on laughter at midnight, on a tasteless dessert, on the fact that someone sat down next to you and stayed. In the 9th week, something serious happened. A letter arrived from Redmark, not from the innkeeper, from the Merchants Guild. The letter was polite, formal, and venomous. The guild stated that trading in smoked fish without a guild permit was a violation of the city charter, that Baron Westerland must either join the guild and pay an annual fee of 120 crowns or cease sales. Serafina read the letter twice. Her face turned to stone. 120 crowns, 1.5 times a year's tax, a sum that nipped the trade in the bud. That was exactly why it had been devised, not to collect money, but to destroy a competitor. Daniel read the letter. Then he sat down and thought. In Chicago, this happened regularly. Large companies squeezed out small ones through regulations, certifications, and standards that cost so much that small businesses were suffocating. There was only one solution: find out what the oppressor wanted. He asked Serafina what she knew about the guild. She knew a lot. The Holt Trading House had been working with guilds its entire existence. She explained. The Redmark Guild consists of 7 merchants. The head of the guild is an old man named Walter Crane. He trades in grain and cloth. He's controlled the market for 30 years. He isn't interested in Westerland fish. He's interested in the principle. If one merchant trades outside the guild and gets away with it, tomorrow everyone will do the same, and his monopoly will collapse. Daniel asked what Crane was afraid of. Serafina thought for a moment. She replied that Crane feared only one thing: the southern merchants. Large caravans from the coast that pass through the region once a year and drive down prices. The Redmark Guild is too small to compete with them directly. Daniel asked when the next caravan was coming. Serafina replied that it would be in the spring, in 3 months. Daniel nodded. He asked her to write a letter to Crane, not a response to the ultimatum, but an invitation to dinner in Westerland. Serafina looked at him as if he were a man suggesting they invite a wolf into the henhouse. He replied that the wolf already knew where the henhouse was. The question was whether he could be turned into a guard dog. She wrote the letter. Crane arrived 4 days later, alone, without guards. An old man in his 70s, thin, wiry, with eyes that took in everything, from the number of stones in the wall to the value of Daniel's doublet. He sat down at the table. Barris served dinner: smoked fish, venison, bread, honeyed nuts, seasoned with ginger and salt. Crane tasted the fish. His expression didn't change, but he asked for seconds. That told Daniel everything he needed to know. Then they talked. Daniel didn't haggle. He didn't ask for a lower fee. He didn't make threats. He asked Crane how he planned to handle the southern caravan in the spring. Crane fell silent. It was a question not to be asked over dinner. It was a question to be asked at a closed guild council meeting. Daniel continued. He said that the southern caravans carried salted fish, cheap fish, in large quantities. They drive down prices on local produce and then leave. The locals are left with empty stalls and angry customers who've grown accustomed to low prices. Crane listened. His eyes narrowed. Daniel made a proposal. Westerland would sell smoked fish through the guild, not bypassing it, through it, but not for a 120 krona fee, for 10% of the sales. The guild gets a share and control. Westerland gets access to the market without a predatory fee. And when the southern caravan arrives in the spring with cheap salted fish, Westerland will put out his smoked fish. A different product, a different price, a different customer. The Southerners aren't competitors. They're just background noise. They sell mass market goods. Westerland sells a delicacy, together with the guild. Crane was silent for a long time. Then he asked how a young baron from the outskirts knew about the southern caravans. Daniel replied that his wife knew, and that his wife knew more about trade than all 7 guild members put together. Serafina sat at the table without batting an eye. Crane looked at her. He asked if she was the Holt's daughter. Serafina replied that she had been.
Crane paused. Then he said that being the Holt's daughter was a serious matter. The House of Holt had fallen apart, but it hadn't fallen apart because the Holts were stupid. It had fallen apart because the elder Holt was a greedy idiot. A daughter was a different matter. He stood up. He shook Daniel's hand. Then he turned to Serafina and bowed, briefly, in a merchant's manner, a gesture of acknowledgement. He said he'd send the contract in a week, 10%. When he left, Serafina sat at the table, motionless. Daniel asked if everything was all right. She replied that she was fine. Her voice was steady, but her hands on the table trembled slightly. He understood. It was the first time anyone had said out loud in her presence that her father was an idiot, and she was not. The first time she had been bowed to, not her last name, but for who she was. He didn't bring it up. He simply stood up and said that Barris had left some honeyed nuts and that she deserved a dessert. She snorted, but she took a nut. Week 10, midwinter. Westerland was alive. Not thriving, but alive. The smokehouse was running. The blacksmith's forge clanged. Ashley brought in game every 3 days. Hannah treated the villagers. Una trained the guard, which now numbered 8 people. Madeline managed the household so well that Alvin stopped asking Daniel about domestic matters and went straight to her instead. Serafina counted the money, and for the first time, the finances were starting to add up the right way. In the 10th week, Daniel decided it was time to talk to each of them individually. Not about work, not about plans, about them. He started with Madeline, because Madeline was the most closed off. Not the coldest, Serafina was colder. Not the quietest, Hannah was quieter. Madeline was as closed off as a chest with 3 locks. She worked, she was useful, she was the perfect housekeeper. And that was exactly what made Daniel wary. She was too perfect, like someone who had learned to be indispensable because they knew the cost of being replaced. He found her that evening in the pantry. She was counting bags of flour. She touched each one with her hands, checking for dampness. He sat down on a barrel nearby, silently. She kept counting. Then, without turning around, she asked what he wanted. He replied that he wanted to know how she was. Not, "How are you?" but, "How is she?" She stopped. She turned around. She looked at him with the kind of gaze one uses when looking at a door that leads into a dark room. You want to go in, but you're afraid. She said she was fine. He said he knew she was fine, but that wasn't what he was asking. She was silent. Then she sat down on a sack across from him. She ran her hand over her face. She said she dreams about her first husband every night. Not nightmares, worse, ordinary dreams. Dinner, his voice, his hands, as if she were still there, as if the past 10 years hadn't ended. She woke up and didn't immediately realize where she was. Daniel listened. He knew what that was like. Not from personal experience, from experience with others. There was a woman on his team in Chicago, Linda, an accountant, the best specialist on the floor, the perfect employee. Once, at a company party, she had one too many drinks and confessed that she'd lived for 15 years with a husband who controlled her every move. That she counted money at work because at home she wasn't allowed to spend a single cent. That she worked flawlessly because she was punished for any imperfection. Madeline was the same way. 10 years with a husband who was twice her age, a cruel old man. She'd learned to be flawless because a mistake cost too much. Daniel didn't offer advice. He didn't try to comfort her. He didn't say everything would be all right. He said one thing, that in this house, she was allowed to make mistakes. If she forgot to count a sack, or dropped a pitcher, or slept in until noon, nothing would happen. No one would punish her. No one would hit her. No one would look at her in a way that made her want to disappear. She could be imperfect, and that would be okay. Madeline sat on a sack of flour in the cold pantry and looked at him. Then she lowered her head. Her shoulders trembled. Just once. She didn't cry, but she was close, closer than she'd been in 10 years. Daniel stood up. He said breakfast was at 7 and that Barris had promised pancakes if Ashley brought eggs from the village. Madeline raised her head. She nodded. He left. The next day, Madeline dropped a pitcher in the dining room, a clay one. It shattered into 5 pieces. Milk spilled across the floor. Madeline froze. She stood over the shards and didn't move, like someone waiting for a blow. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then, Barris called out from the kitchen that he still had milk. Tim, the young boy, ran over with a rag. Alvin brought a new pitcher. Madeline stood there watching as the people around her simply cleaned it up. No questions, no reproaches, without glances.
She picked up a shard, then a second one. Then she quietly said thank you. No one paid any attention, except for Daniel, who saw from the corner of the room, and except for Serafina, who was sitting at the table and looking at Madeline as if she had recognized something familiar. In the 11th week, Daniel talked to Ashley, or rather, he tried to. Ashley didn't talk. She just did. She'd silently go into the woods, she'd silently return with her catch, she'd silently eat, she'd silently go up to the roof. She was like a wild animal that lives near people but not among them. Daniel found another approach. He asked her to show him the woods. She looked at him with an expression that said he'd be dead in the woods within an hour. He said he'd probably die, but he'd like to know what was around his castle. She agreed. They set out at dawn. Ashley walked ahead. Daniel followed behind. The snow was knee-deep. He sank with every step. She glided across the surface on her snowshoes as if on a hardwood floor. An hour later, he was soaked and gasping for breath. She hadn't even broken a sweat. But she spoke. In the woods, she spoke. Not much, but more than she had at the castle. She pointed out tracks. A deer, a fox, a hare. A bone-white wolf passed right here. See the claws? Deep. A heavy beast. An old one. Young ones are lighter. Here's a marten trap. Here's a stream under the ice. Can you hear it murmuring? That means the ice is thin. Don't go there. She knew the forest as well as Serafina knew numbers, as well as Hannah knew herbs, as well as Una knew blades. Absolutely. Completely. With every inch of her skin. They stopped on a hill. The view opened up onto the valley. The castle below, small, gray, with smoke rising from the chimney. A village nearby, a dozen houses, a river beyond the forest, a white ribbon in the snow. Daniel stood and looked. Ashley stood beside him. He said it was beautiful. She looked at him in surprise, then at the valley. She said yes, beautiful. But she thinks of something else when she looks from here. He asked what. She said she thinks about how to protect it, where the enemy would come from, how to retreat, where the ambush would be, where the watering hole for the horses was, where people could take cover if the castle fell. Daniel looked at her, 19 years old, and she looks at the landscape and sees a battlefield. Because her whole life she'd been told she wasn't good enough for the world, and that the only place she was needed was between people and whatever wanted to kill them. He said he'd like her to draw a map of the surrounding area, with trails, with hiding places, with places where game roams, with places that are dangerous. She asked why. He replied that it was because no one knew this land better than she did, and that if Westerland had a map drawn up by the best tracker in the region, it would be worth more than the castle's walls. She was silent. Then she asked quietly, "Do you really think I'm the best?" He replied that he didn't think so. He knew it. He'd seen how she shot, how she moved through the woods, and how she read tracks. And if he had an employee in Chicago who knew his territory as well as she knew this forest, he'd pay him twice as much as the others. She turned away, quickly. She hid her face. But he heard her sniffle, once. On the way back, she walked more slowly. She waited for him. She didn't run ahead. When he sank into the snow, she stopped and waited silently, but without irritation. At the castle gate, she stopped. She looked at him. She said she'd start on the map tomorrow, and she went up to the roof. But that evening at dinner, she sat down at the table. For the first time, not by the wall, but at the table, next to Hannah. No one commented, but everyone noticed. The 12th week, the end of winter. The snow had begun to melt, but slowly. It still froze at night. During the day, water dripped from the roofs. The roads had thawed. Daniel stood on the castle wall and looked south, the road to Redmark. Serafina was supposed to be returning along it. She had left 2 days ago with a caravan, the first large caravan. 30 pounds of smoked fish, 20 knives made by Roderick, 10 pounds of honey nuts. The total value of the goods was, according to Serafina's calculations, about 150 crowns, if they sold everything. Una was traveling with her, along with 2 guards she had trained, Garth and a village lad named Kovan. Both carried swords that Roderick had forged from old iron. The swords were crude, but sharp. Daniel was waiting. Not because he was worried about the goods, he was worried about the people. This was the first trip on which Serafina was carrying a significant amount of money, and the first time the whole of Redmark knew about the Westerland trade, which meant those who didn't like it knew about it too. The caravan returned by evening. Serafina entered the gate first. Her face was tired, but her eyes were ablaze. Una rode alongside her. Her face bore an expression that Daniel had learned to read, calm satisfaction.
That meant the road had been clear. Or not entirely clear, but the problem had been resolved. Serafina set a sack on the table. It was heavy. She untied it. Silver. Daniel counted it. She waited. 173 kroner. More than expected. 23 kroner more. He looked at her. She let herself smile. A real one. Not just the corner of her mouth, but a full smile. It lasted 3 seconds, but those were the best 3 seconds ever. She explained. The knives sold for more than they'd planned. Crane himself showed them to a gunsmith he knew from the capital's caravan, who was passing through Redmark. The gunsmith took an interest. He bought 10 of them for 7 crowns each, instead of 5, and he ordered 20 more for the spring. All the smoked fish was sold. The innkeeper took 15 pounds. The rest was sold out at the market in half a day. The mayor's wife bought the honeyed nuts, all 10 pounds, for a reception, and she asked for more. Serafina said that the mayor of Redmark wanted to meet. He wanted to discuss a trade agreement between the city and Westerland, not through the guild, but directly. This meant that Westerland had become prominent enough to attract the authorities' attention, a good sign and a dangerous one at the same time. Daniel asked about the road. Una replied briefly. On the way back, near a copse, 3 men emerged from behind the trees. They were filthy, armed with sticks and a single rusty sword. Not bandits, hungry people. Una placed her hand on her sword, and they left. But the fact remained, the road isn't safe. Daniel nodded. He asked Una how many people were needed to secure the trade route. Una replied that at least 6 permanent guards were needed, 4 for the caravan and 2 on rotation, plus 2 checkpoints along the road. That meant 10 more people to feed, arm, and train. Daniel looked at Serafina. Serafina had already done the math. She said that 10 guards would cost 40 crowns a month. Food, weapons, clothing. With their current income, that's a third of their earnings. A lot. But if trade grinds to a halt because of robberies, the losses will be even greater. Daniel said he'd figure it out. Then he turned to Una and asked if she could recruit people. Una replied that she could, but she didn't need peasants with sticks. She needed people who wanted to learn, young, healthy, and ready to follow orders. Daniel said he'd put up a notice in the village asking who wanted to serve in the Westerland Guard. Food, lodging, 1 krona a month, and training from the best swordsman they'd ever seen. Una nodded slightly. She still wasn't used to him speaking of her that way. In front of everyone, without reservation. That evening at dinner, Daniel announced the total. 173 crowns. The quarterly tax was 80. Even after all their expenses, they still had money left over. For the first time. Barris prepared a festive dinner. Not with luxurious ingredients, just with what was on hand. But he cooked it with heart. Venison with herbs, fish smoked over alder and applewood, fresh bread, honeyed nuts, Hana's hot and spicy broth, wine. Not the sour stuff from the cellar, but decent wine. Serafina had bought a cask in Redmark for 3 crowns. She called it an investment in morale. Daniel thought she was coming up with concepts faster than he could name them. 6 of them sat at the table, and for the first time in 3 months, the silence wasn't heavy, but peaceful. Madeline said the roof in the west wing needed a complete overhaul by spring. They needed boards, shingles, nails, and at least 5 pairs of hands. Serafina said she could set aside 20 crowns in the budget for materials. Madeline nodded. They discussed the budget. Hana said she needed more space to store herbs, and that it would be nice to have a drying room. A separate, warm room. Madeline said there was an empty room in the east wing, next to the kitchen chimney. The heat from the chimney would dry the herbs for free. Hana looked at her gratefully, quietly, without words, but clearly. Ashley said the map was almost ready. It covered the area within a day's journey around the castle. Forests, hills, streams, trails, animal paths, 3 bone wolf dens, 2 tenebrin nests that were best left alone, and a spot by the northern stream where the water is so pure that Hana can use it for her potions. Una said she had 5 ready for duty. 3 more are in training. By spring, there will be 10, enough to patrol the road and guard the castle. Daniel listened. They were talking to each other, not through him. Madeline was responding to Seraphine. Hana was addressing Madeline. Ashley was giving information to Hana. Una was coordinating with Ashley on patrol routes. He sat there in silence. And that was the best thing he could do. A team that works through a leader is good. A team that works together is great. After dinner, he went out into the courtyard. The snow was melting. Stars. It was cold, but not as cold as a month ago. The air smelled of spring. Distant, but he could smell it. He stood there and counted in his head. 3 months, 90 days. He remembered his first day. An empty basement, rotten fish, Olven with the face of a man at a funeral, thin, unfamiliar hands, a scroll bearing the royal seal. Now he had a smokehouse, a blacksmith shop, a trade contract with the guild, Guards, a map of the territory. Travnitskaya, a blacksmith, another family, and 5 women who, 3 months ago, had hated him and each other, but now, over dinner, were discussing the budget for roof repairs. He thought that in Chicago they would call this a successful first quarter. But he never finished writing that quarterly report, not in that life, nor in this one. A door creaked behind him. Hannah came out. She stood silently beside him. She handed him a mug, hot herbal tea. He took it. She said she'd noticed he wasn't wearing gloves and that his hands were red from the cold. He said he didn't have any gloves. She said that Mira, Roderick's wife, knew how to sew. She'd ask her to make him some gloves, out of deerskin, lined with fur. He looked at her. Petite, dark hair, tired eyes, hands that had healed 12 villagers in 3 months, 3 children, 1 old man, and 1 baron whose palms he'd hacked off with an axe. She stood beside him, thinking about his gloves. He said thank you. She nodded. She stood there for another minute. Then she left. The door closed. Daniel stood in the courtyard with a hot mug in his cold hands and thought that this was what made life worth living. Not for the 173 crowns, not for the trade contract, but because someone had noticed that his hands were freezing and brought him something hot. Spring arrived like a guest we'd been expecting but hadn't had time to prepare for. The snow melted in 2 weeks. The roads turned into rivers of mud. The stream burst its banks and flooded the lower field. But the sun was warm, and along with the sun came people. First 2, then 5, then a whole family with a cart and a goat. Refugees. Not from just one place, from different places. From the east, where mercenaries were burning villages. From the north, where the baron had doubled the tax and the peasants had fled. From the south, where the spring flood had washed away 3 villages and the people had nowhere else to go. Everyone had heard the same thing. In Westerland, they provide work and food. The baron is strange, but he doesn't beat people. His wives are strange too, but they treat the sick and don't charge for it. Daniel stood at the gate and looked at the line of 12 people. Men, women, children, an old man with a cane, a young man with a bandaged arm, a woman holding a baby. Olven stood beside him. His face had the look of a man who sees hungry people coming to his house and doesn't know if there will be enough food. Daniel knew there wouldn't be enough. With their current supplies, 12 extra mouths to feed would be a disaster. Serafina would confirm this with the numbers. Madeline would confirm it by checking the pantry. But he also knew something else. Each of these people had a skill. The farmers knew how to plow. The women knew how to sew, cook, and weave. The young man with the bandaged arm might be a carpenter or a mason. The old man might know things the young ones didn't. The baby will grow up. He let everyone in. Serafina came to him an hour later. Her face was the same as ever. Cold. Workers. She said that 12 mouths to feed meant a loss of 14 crowns a month. With their current income, that was the limit. He asked what would happen if 8 out of the 12 started working. She did the math. If 8 work, 2 will plow the lower field once the water recedes, 2 will help Barris in the smokehouse, 1 goes to Roderick's smithy, 1 helps Madeline with the household, 2 go to Una's watch. If that's the case, in 2 months they'll not only pay for themselves, but also turn a profit. Daniel nodded. Serafina looked at him. Then she said he was taking a risk. What if 20 more come? Or 50? He can't feed them all. He replied that he couldn't. But he could feed those who feed others, the people who work, who contribute, a self-sustaining cycle. The more hands there are, the more food there is, and the more hands can be taken in. She said it works until it breaks down. He replied that everything works until it breaks down. His job was to fix things faster than they broke. She snorted, but she didn't argue. A week later, the lower field had dried out. 2 farmers went out to plow. The soil was heavy, but they knew what to do. The villagers joined them. For the first time in many years, the field by the castle was being worked in its entirety. Madeline was in charge. She stood at the edge of the field with a parchment in her hands, assigning plots. Who plows where, who sows what, when to water, when to weed. She knew all this. 10 years of managing her husband's estate. A cruel husband who wasn't even hers. But the knowledge remained, and for the first time, they were working not for someone else, but for her home, for her people. She didn't say this out loud, but Daniel saw her walking through the field, not as an overseer, but as a mistress standing on her own land for the first time. In the 3rd week of spring, a messenger arrived from the capital, on horseback, wearing the livery of the royal chancellery, bearing a letter sealed with 3 seals. Alvin took the letter and turned pale. Daniel read it. The letter was from the office of Queen Regent Isolde. It was official. The Baron of Westerland was ordered to appear in the capital to report on the state of his estates and on his compliance with the terms of the unifying edict. He was to appear within 30 days.
Failure to appear would be considered disobedience to the crown. Daniel reread it, calmly. Then he folded the letter and put it in his pocket. That evening, he gathered everyone together, 6 at the table. Olven by the wall. Barris stood by the door. Daniel showed them the letter. He read it aloud. Silence. Serafina spoke first. She said this wasn't a report. It was a test. The crown wanted to see if Westerland was still alive, and if he was, whether he was living too comfortably. Madeline said that a summons to the capital for a baron from the outskirts was a bad sign. Barons from the outskirts don't travel to the capital. They're summoned when the crown wants to take something away from them. Una said it might be a trap, to lure the baron out of the castle, to leave the castle without a leader, and while he's in the capital, to send people to finish what the decree couldn't. Ashley said nothing, but her hand rested on the knife hanging from her belt, mechanically, like a reflex. Hannah asked quietly if he should go. Daniel replied that he had to. Not showing up would be worse. If he didn't go, the crown would have an excuse to take everything openly. If he went, he'd have a chance to show that Westerland paid its taxes and obeyed the law. Serafina said she'd go with him. He looked at her. She explained, "The capital isn't a sword or an arrow. The capital is paperwork and numbers and people who smile while they're slitting your throat." She knows that world. She grew up in it. Her father had been a merchant at court for 20 years. She knows who's in bed with whom and for how much. Daniel agreed. Una said she would go too. Serafina objected that 3 people from the castle was too many. Una replied that a baron without guards in the capital was a dead man. Daniel said Una was right. The 3 of them, him, Serafina, and Una. Madeline would stay behind to manage the estate. Ashley would handle hunting and reconnaissance. Hannah would be in charge of the people. Alvin would report to Madeline. Madeline nodded. There was something new in her eyes. He was leaving the castle to her. Not just to look after it, not just for a while. He was leaving his home to her. And by doing so, he was saying that he trusted her more than he trusted himself. She said the castle would still be standing when he returned. It wasn't a promise. It was an oath. Preparations for his departure took a week. Serafina gathered the documents, all records of income, of taxes, of trade, of the population. Every figure was verified. Every fact was confirmed. She said that if the capital wanted a report, it would get one that would make the bureaucrats' eyes pop out of their heads. Una checked the weapons. 2 blades, sharpened by Roderick himself. He'd forged them for 2 days and said he'd never had better steel. Una tested the balance and nodded. Coming from Roderick, that meant he was a master. On the morning of their departure, everyone gathered in the courtyard. 3 horses. Daniel had learned to ride over the winter. Not well, but he held on. Serafina rode like someone who'd grown up in the saddle. Una rode like someone who'd been born in the saddle. Madeline stood by the gate. Ashley was on the wall. Hannah was in the castle doorway. Alvin was next to Madeline. Barris was in the kitchen doorway. Roderick was by the smithy. Mira was holding Nell in her arms. The villagers were by the road. Everyone was watching. Daniel stopped his horse. He turned around. He looked at them, at the castle, at the people, at the smoke rising from the kitchen chimney, at the parchment with the organizational chart that he'd seen through the dining hall window. 5 names on the wall. He turned forward and urged his horse on. The journey to the capital took 6 days. The capital of Ertan was called Cornhall, a city of 500,000 souls, stone walls 20 times a man's height, towers, spires, squares paved with granite, streets where people walked in clothes worth more than the entire Westerland in a year. Daniel rode down the main street and counted. It was a habit. He counted the shops, the guards, the beggars, the carts, the street lamps, the gutters, trash on the pavement. The city was rich on the outside and rotten on the inside. Beautiful facades and stinking alleys. Guards in polished armor and beggars in rags just 2 houses away. A familiar sight. Chicago was exactly the same. Serafina rode beside him, silent, but her eyes darted quickly. She saw what he saw, and more. She knew this city, knew who owned the houses, knew which coats of arms hung above the doors, knew what the color of the shutters and the shape of the signs meant. Una rode behind them, back straight, arms relaxed, eyes everywhere. She wasn't looking at the beauty. She was looking at the corners and the roofs and the shadows between the houses. Professional paranoia. Useful paranoia. They were met by an official from the chancellery, a small man with small eyes and a long list in his hands. He led them to the guest quarters next to the palace. 2 rooms, clean, modest, without luxury. Accommodations for those who were summoned, not invited. Daniel surveyed the rooms. Then he asked when the audience would take place. The official replied that it would be tomorrow at noon, before the Crown Councillor, Lord Chancellor Velian Ashtor. When Seraphina heard the name, her expression changed. She didn't turn pale. She wasn't frightened. On the contrary, she grew steeper, sharper, like a blade drawn from its sheath. When the official left, Seraphina said that Ashtor was the one who had drafted the unifying decree. She knew this, not from guesswork, from reliable sources. Her father had once done business with the Chancellery and had seen drafts of the decree on Ashtor's desk a month before its publication. Her father had realized then that his daughter was doomed and had done nothing. Daniel asked what she knew about Ashtor. Seraphina knew a great deal. Velian Ashtor, 62 years old, Lord Chancellor to Queen Regent Isolde, formerly the second highest ranking official in the kingdom, in reality, the first. Isolde is young and inexperienced, and Ashtor guides her as a mentor guides a student, gently, unobtrusively, in the right direction. He is not a villain in the classical sense. He does not torment people for pleasure. He is not greedy, he is not vain. He sincerely believes he is saving the kingdom, that the great houses are leading Ayrton towards civil war, and that the only way to prevent it is to weaken them all at once. The unifying decree was part of the plan, to gather the troublesome heiresses, to neutralize their houses, to reshuffle the deck. Daniel asked why they had summoned him then. If Ashtor wanted Westerland to die quietly, why check up on him? Seraphina replied that Ashtor didn't want Westerland to die. He wanted Westerland to be weak, controllable, safe. But Westerland had become strong, and that threw a wrench in the plan. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat by the window and looked out at the city. He weighed his options.
Una stood by the door. She wasn't sleeping either. He asked her why she was standing there. She replied that she was standing guard. He said this was a palace, with guards, with walls. She replied that was exactly why. The guards are strangers. The walls are strangers. The door has no bolt on the inside. She'll stay here. He didn't argue. Noon, the council chamber. A long table, tall windows. Light streamed in slanting strips. 3 people sat at the table. A secretary with papers, a scribe with a quill, and Velian Ashtor. Daniel saw him and understood why Seraphina had tensed up. Ashtor didn't look dangerous. He looked kind. An elderly man with a gentle face, gray hair, a neat beard, warm, intelligent eyes, a soft voice, calm hands. If Daniel had run into him on the street, he would have thought he was a college professor, or a librarian, or a grandfather who takes his grandchildren fishing. But Daniel had been managing people for 8 years, and he knew one thing. The most dangerous people are the ones who look harmless, because they don't waste energy on putting on a show. All their strength goes into the task at hand. Ashtor smiled. He greeted Baron Westerland. He said he was glad to see him alive and well, given the circumstances. Daniel bowed, briefly, just as Alvin had taught him. Ashtor asked for a report. Seraphina stepped forward. She was wearing the best dress they could find in Westerland, not luxurious, but clean and neat. She placed a stack of parchments in front of Ashtor. Ashtor looked at the stack, then at Seraphina. Something flashed in his eyes. Recognition. He said, "The Holt's daughter." Seraphina replied, "The Westerland's wife." A pause. Ashtor tilted his head slightly. Then he began to read. He read slowly, carefully, turning the pages. Sometimes he went back a page. Sometimes he raised an eyebrow. Once he looked at Daniel over the parchment, for a long time. Then he returned to reading. 20 minutes later, he finished. He placed the papers on the table, folded his hands, and said he was impressed. It was said without irony, without a catch. He was genuinely impressed. In 4 months, a destitute barony on the outskirts had increased its revenue 6-fold. It had paid its taxes on time and in full. It had taken in refugees. It had established trade. It had created a guard force. It had set up a blacksmith shop. It had signed a contract with the city guild. It had planted a field that had lain fallow for 10 years. It was impossible. But the numbers didn't lie. Ashtor asked how. Daniel replied briefly, "The right people in the right places." Ashtor smiled. He said it was a nice phrase, but not enough. He wanted to know the details. Daniel told him. Not everything. Enough. About the fish and the smoking process. About the blacksmith. About trade through the guild. About hunting and the guard. He didn't mention his wives by name. He didn't expose them. He didn't make them targets. He spoke of himself and his decisions. Ashtor listened. He nodded. Then he said one thing that changed everything. He said he was forced to inform the Baron of a complaint, one that had been received by the Chancellery from the House of Ji. Marshal Ji Wang, Yuna's father, Ji Wang demands his daughter's return. He points out that the bonding marriage was concluded in violation of procedure, and that his daughter is being held in Westerland against her will. Daniel felt Yuna stop breathing behind him, for a single second. Then she exhaled, quietly, controlled, just like in training. Ashter continued.
He said that the Chancellery would review the complaint within a month. Until the Chancellery's decision, Lady Juwa must remain in Westerland. But if the decision goes in the Marshal's favor, Daniel will have to take his wife back. Daniel stood there, thinking. 3 seconds. Then he asked if the Lord Chancellor would like to hear Lady Juwa's own opinion. Ashtor raised an eyebrow. He said that a wife's opinion on matters of transfer between houses was not usually taken into account. Daniel replied that in Westerland, it was. Ashtor looked at him, then at Yuna, then back at Daniel, and he smiled. Not warmly, not gently. It was the smile of a chess player who had seen a move he hadn't expected. He said the audience was over, that the Chancellery would contact the Baron regarding the complaint, and that he personally recommended the Baron not to linger in the capital any longer than necessary. It was a warning. Quiet, polite, but a warning. Leave while you still can. As they were leaving the hall, Yuna caught up with Daniel. She grabbed his sleeve, hard. He stopped. She stood there, looking at him. Her face was stony, but her eyes weren't. In her eyes was something he had never seen there before. Fear. Not for herself, for the fact that they would take her away from the only place where she was needed, not because she was convenient, but because she was valuable. Daniel placed his hand on hers, the one that was gripping his sleeve, and said quietly, "No one is taking anyone anywhere." She swallowed. She nodded. She let go of his sleeve. She straightened up. Her face was stony again, but her fingers were still trembling. They left the next morning. Serafina insisted. She said that every extra day in the capital was a day when someone was gathering information about them and finding a way to strike. Daniel agreed. The trip back took 5 days, faster than the trip there. The horses had rested, the roads had dried out, and all 3 of them wanted to go home. Daniel caught himself using that word. Home. 4 months ago, he'd woken up in a stranger's body in a strange world. Now he was riding home, to a castle with a cracked ceiling and a roof made of planks and oiled canvas. And that was home. They saw the towers of Westerland from the hill 2 hours before sunset. Ashley was standing on the wall. She was the first to see them, because Ashley was always the first to see. By the time they rode through the gates, everyone was in the courtyard. Madeline, Hannah, Ashley, Alvin, Barris, Roderick, the guards, the servants, the villagers, everyone. Madeline approached first. She gave her report, briefly, to the point. During the Baron's 10-day absence, the roof in the west wing has been completely repaired, tiles and boards, and everything is dry. 3/4 of the field has been sown. The smokehouse is running smoothly, so is the smithy. 2 new refugees have been taken in, 1 potter and 1 weaver. Mira, Roderick's wife, has started sewing clothes to sell. 3 shirts are already finished. The tax was paid through a merchant passing through the capital. That's all. Madeline fell silent. She stood and waited. Daniel looked at her. 4 months ago, she had arrived at the castle, and in 40 minutes, all the problems had vanished. Now she stood there, reporting on how she'd solved problems that didn't even exist when he'd left. He told her she'd done a magnificent job. Madeline shrugged. She said it was her duty. He said no, it was her choice. There's a difference. She looked at him. The corner of her mouth twitched. She turned and walked away. But her back was straighter, not tensely straight, like that of someone who'd been beaten for slouching, calmly straight, like that of someone who knows their own worth. That evening at dinner, Daniel talked about the capital. Not everything. Enough. About Ashtor and his reaction to the report. About the warning not to linger, and about Marshal Ji Wang's complaint. At those words, the table fell silent. Yuna sat motionless. She ate. She didn't look up. Madeline looked at Yuna, then at Daniel. She asked what he intended to do. Daniel replied that he intended to respond to the complaint officially, through the Chancellery, with documents, with evidence that Yuna was not being held against her will, that she was the head of the guard, that she had accepted the duties voluntarily, and that taking her away would leave the barony defenseless, which would be a violation of the crown's interests. Serafina nodded. She said she would draft a response, legally airtight. Hannah said quietly that if the marshal needed proof that his daughter was here of her own free will, he should come and ask her himself. Ashley put it more bluntly. She said that if anyone tried to take Yuna away, she would shoot. Yuna raised her head. She looked at Ashley, at Hannah, at Madeline, at Serafina. The four women were looking at her, and each gaze conveyed the same message. You're one of us. Try to take her away. Yuna swallowed. Then she nodded briefly. She stood up. She stepped away from the table. She went out into the courtyard. Daniel saw her through the window, standing alone in the dark. Her face turned toward the sky. Her shoulders slumped, her arms at her sides. She stood like that for 5 minutes. Then she straightened up. She came back. She sat down. She picked up her mug. She took a drink. She didn't say a word. But something had changed. In her, in them, in all of them. The next 2 weeks were spent working. Serafina drafted a response to the marshal's complaint. 12 pages. Every reference to the law. Every argument substantiated. Daniel read it and thought that if he had a lawyer like that in Chicago, he'd win every contract. The response was sent by courier. At the same time, Daniel was doing what he'd wanted to do for a long time. He began teaching. Not at school, not from books. In his own way. Every evening after dinner, he would sit with Alvin, Tim, and 2 villagers and show them how to count. Not complicated math, simple stuff. How many sacks of flour were in the pantry? How much was used each day? How many days the supply would last? If 10 sacks arrived each week and 7 were used, how much would accumulate over a month? Alvin frowned and sweated. Tim caught on quickly. The villagers nodded and mixed up 2 times 2 with 2 times 3. But a week later, Tim was already keeping the records in the storeroom himself, with a pencil that Daniel had made from a charred stick and a piece of birch bark. Tim became Westerland's first literate bookkeeper since Serafina. He was 14. 3 weeks later, a reply arrived from the Chancellery. Marshal Jiwan's complaint had been rejected. The wording was terse. The Chancellery found no grounds for annulling the binding marriage as it pertained to Lady Jiwa. Yuna read the letter. She rolled it up. She put it in her pocket. She turned toward Daniel. She said one word. Thank you. Then she left to train the guards. She trained them harder than usual, but they didn't complain. Because they saw that the commander was smiling. For the first time, in the 4th week after returning from the capital, an unexpected guest arrived, on horseback, alone, without an escort, a woman in her 40s wearing a traveling cloak. She introduced herself as Alice Thorne, an envoy from House Holt. Serafina went out to the gate and stopped. Her face went pale. Alice Thorne was not just an envoy. She was Serafina's father's right-hand woman, the person who had managed the House of Holt's accounts for 20 years, the only person Elder Holt trusted with money. Serafina had grown up alongside her. Alice Thorne had taught her how to count. Alice dismounted. She looked at Serafina. She said she had come on Lord Holt's request. Serafina's father wants his daughter back. Not the daughter herself, but her brain. The House of Holt is once again on the brink of bankruptcy. For the 3rd time. He can't manage without Serafina. He's willing to pay Westerland compensation, 500 kroner. Serafina stood and listened, her face as still as stone. Her hands were at her sides. Daniel stood beside her, silent. It wasn't his decision. Serafina turned to Alice. Her voice was steady and quiet. She said that her father had sold her to pay off debts, given her away like an object, and now he wants to buy her back, like an object. She said the answer was no, that she was Lady Westerland, that her home was here, that her work was here, that 500 crowns weren't worth a single day in the house of a man who trades in daughters. Alice was silent. Then she nodded. She said she would pass on the message. She turned toward her horse. Serafina called out to her. She asked how Alice herself was doing. Alice turned back. Her face looked tired. She said she was doing poorly, that the house was falling apart, that Elder Holt was drinking, that the servants were running away. Serafina paused. Then she said that if Alice ever wanted to leave the Holts, there would be a place in Westerland for a good bookkeeper. Alice looked at her for a long time. Then she mounted her horse and rode away. Serafina stood at the gate until the horse disappeared behind the hill. Then she turned. She walked past Deal. He saw her eyes, dry, steady, but red at the edges. She wasn't crying, but she was close to it. She went into her office. She closed the door. An hour later, Daniel knocked. Silence. He set the tray down by the door. Smoked fish, bread, a mug of broth. Just like on the first day. By morning, the tray was empty. Summer, the 6th month. Westerland had changed. It was unrecognizable. The fields were turning green. The first shoots of wheat and barley were appearing. Madeline stood at the edge and counted the rows. The smokehouse was running 3 shifts. Barris had trained 2 assistants and was now producing 30 pounds of smoked fish a week. Roderick's blacksmith shop had expanded. He'd taken on an apprentice from the village, a lad named Graham.
Clumsy but diligent, within a month he was forging nails just as well as the master. Hana opened a clinic, a real one, not just a room with herbs, but a separate building next to the castle. It was small, with 2 rooms, one for examinations and the other for seriously ill patients. Thomas the carpenter built the beds, and Mira sewed the bedding. Hana grew the herbs herself in the garden behind the eastern wall. People came to her not only from the village, but also from neighboring settlements. They walked for half a day to see the healer from Westerland. She never turned anyone away, and she didn't take any money. Daniel suggested she charge at least a nominal fee. She looked at him in such a way that he didn't bring it up again. But Serafina found a solution. Patients who could pay did so not with money, but with whatever they had. A sack of grain, a basket of eggs, a skein of yarn. Barter. Hana treated them. Westerland prospered. Una commanded a guard of 14 men. A real guard, not peasants with sticks. Men who knew how to stand in formation, handle weapons, and not run at the sound of a stranger's horn. She drove them until they were drenched in sweat and scolded them so harshly that Alvin blushed. But they followed her, because she led the way, always, in the rain and in the heat, and at dawn when they wanted to sleep. First, Ashley drew up a map, a complete one, the territory within a 2-day journey of the castle, every trail, every stream, every den. Daniel hung the map in the dining hall next to the organizational chart, 2 parchments on the wall, structure and territory, people and land. Serafina had signed 4 trade contracts. Fish went to Redmark and the 2 cities beyond it. Roderick's knives were sold through a weaponsmith from the capital. Honeynuts had become known in 3 cities, and Serafina had started something new, wool. The refugees brought sheep with them, not many, just 12, but Serafina did the math. Wool was expensive in Ertan. If the flock doubled in size by fall, they could start selling it. Westerland earned 200 crowns a month. Taxes were covered, no debts, supplies were growing. In the cellar stood barrels of flour, salted meat, and smoked fish. On the shelves were jars of jam that Mira had made from wild berries. 30 knives were waiting to be made at the blacksmith's. Grain was growing in the field. Westerland was living. One morning, Daniel woke up and heard a sound he hadn't heard once in half a year. Laughter. From the dining hall. Loud. Many voices. He went downstairs. All 5 wives were sitting at the table. And Olvin. And Barris. And Tim. Madeline was telling a story about how yesterday Garth had tried to shoe the castle's only mule, and the mule had bitten him on the butt with such force that Garth had flown across the entire courtyard and landed in a barrel of rainwater. Ashley was laughing, her head thrown back, openly. She laughed like a child who had never been told that laughing was shameful. Hana smiled and covered her mouth with her hand, a habit. Serafina sat with the expression of a woman trying with all her might not to laugh, and failing. Una grinned, widely, showing her teeth. She looked younger when she smiled, not 21, but 16. Daniel stood in the doorway and watched them, the 5 women who, 6 months ago, had hated him and each other, who had arrived dressed in black, who hadn't spoken during dinner, who had locked their doors and slept fully clothed because they didn't know what to expect. Now they were laughing, at the same table, together, at the donkey that bit the stable hand. He thought this was the moment worth dying for on the wet asphalt in Chicago, just to stand in the doorway of an old castle and listen to 5 women laugh. Then a messenger arrived, for the second time in half a year. But this one was different. He arrived at night, alone, no livery, no seals. He brought a verbal message from a man in the capital whose name he did not mention. The message was brief. Lord Chancellor Astor has been released from custody due to a lack of direct evidence. His people have stepped up their activities. There are reports that an operation is being prepared against Westerland, not a military one, a quiet one, on paper, through the courts, through an inspection, through any formal pretext that would allow them to seize the lands and dissolve the binding marriage. Daniel asked the messenger who had sent him. The messenger replied that it was a woman, Alice Thorne. Serafina was standing in the doorway while the messenger spoke. She heard the name. Her expression did not change, but she sat down at the table and began to write. She wrote until morning. In the morning, she placed a stack of documents in front of Daniel. She said it was insurance, copies of all contracts, all tax payments, all records of income and expenses. Every page was signed and stamped with the seal that Roderick had cast in bronze at her request a month ago, the Westerland seal, official, registered in Redmark through Crane. If Astor sent an audit, they would find impeccable records. If he took her to court, he would be faced with documents that were impossible to dispute. At 16, Serafina had saved the house from bankruptcy. At 20, she saved it again. Now, at 24, she was building a fortress out of paper. And that fortress was stronger than stone walls. Daniel looked at the documents, then at Serafina. She stood there with dark circles under her eyes after a sleepless night. Her hair was tousled, ink on her fingers. She was beautiful. Not the kind of beauty you notice right away, the kind you notice after you've seen a person at work, after you see what they're capable of. He said she had saved Westerland. She replied that not yet. So far, she had only prepared. We'll save it when they come. He nodded. A week later, they arrived. Not the army, not mercenaries. 3 officials from the capital's inspection bureau, with papers and the authority to inspect the condition of the Westerland barony. For 3 days, they walked through the castle, through the village, through the fields, through the smokehouse, and through the smithy. They counted sacks, checked records, and questioned people. Serafina walked with them, step by step. She had an answer for every question, for every answer, a document, for every document, a seal. The inspectors left on the 3rd day, silently, without complaint, because there were no complaints. Westerland was clean, transparent, impeccable. Serafina stood at the gate and watched them drive away. Her face was calm. Then she turned and went into her office. A minute later, a sound came from inside. A strange sound. Daniel approached the door. Serafina was crying, quietly, into her palm. The way people cry when they've forbidden themselves to cry and finally can't hold it in any longer. He didn't go in. He stood by the door. Then he said quietly through the door that there was smoked fish in the kitchen, that Barris had made a new batch with rosemary, and that he thought she'd like it. Silence. Then a voice. Hoarse. She said she'd be there in 5 minutes. She came in 3. A year. 365 days since that morning when Daniel opened his eyes and saw the stone ceiling with a crack and a spider web. The ceiling had been repaired. Thomas the carpenter had patched the crack. Madeline had swept away the cobwebs herself because she couldn't stand spiders. The canopy had been thrown out and replaced with a new one, blue, embroidered. Mira had spent a month sewing it and had embroidered 5 small figures onto the fabric. 5 women, standing in a row. She didn't say who they were dedicated to. Everyone knew anyway. The castle had changed. The west wing was completely renovated. A new roof, new shutters, whitewashed walls. In the east wing was Hannah's infirmary, with 3 beds and its own pharmacy. Herbs are drying from the ceiling, like garlands of greenery and flowers. The scent is such that everyone who enters takes a deeper breath. The courtyard has been repaved, not all of it, but the central part. The stones were hauled from quarries across the river. The stable is up and running. 4 horses. 2 were purchased, and 2 were gifted by Toll, who has become, if nothing else, a reliable neighbor. The smokehouse has doubled in size. Barris is in charge of production. He has 3 assistants. Roderick's blacksmith shop is the best in the county. Customers come to him from Redmark. Una's guard consists of 22 men. They conduct regular patrols on the road. Not a single robbery in 4 months. The field yielded its first harvest. Not a large one, but it was their own. Madeline stood at the edge and watched as the peasants harvested the wheat. She wasn't smiling. She was beaming. Quietly, inside, but she was beaming. Westerland had become a home for 112 people. 3 villages consider themselves part of the barony. 4 trade contracts, 2 with Redmark, 1 with the town of Tarnwell, a 3-day journey away, 1 with the capital's armorer. Annual income exceeded 2,000 crowns. A pittance for the great houses. A fortune for a destitute barony on the outskirts. Serafina compiled the annual report, 40 pages, with charts. She devised the charts herself, columns on parchment filled in with ink of different colors, revenue growth by month, red columns, expenses, blue, the difference, green. Daniel looked at the charts and thought that in 5 years, this woman would invent spreadsheets. He set the report on the table and said it was the best quarterly review he'd seen in any world. Serafina didn't ask what he meant by any world. She'd long since stopped asking. She simply accepted that her husband sometimes said things that didn't fit any experience, and that those things almost always turned out to be right. On the morning of their anniversary, Daniel stepped out into the yard. Early morning, sun, warmth, August. The air smelled of mown grass and smoke from the smokehouse, and something sweet from Hannah's clinic. He stood and looked at the castle, at the people, at a life that hadn't existed a year ago. Una was training in the courtyard, just like on the first day. 2 blades, a pole. Only now 8 people were training alongside her, and she commanded them not with shouts but with her voice, calm and confident, the voice of someone who knows they are listened to, not out of fear but out of respect. She saw Daniel and nodded, briefly, as an equal. It meant more than any word. Ashley climbed down from the roof. She still slept on the roof, but now there was a canopy, and a mattress, and a deerskin blanket, and a small chest where she kept her things. 3 arrows she considered lucky, a knife made by Roderick, and a drawing, in pencil on birch bark, the castle, a bird's eye view, through her eyes. She'd drawn it during her first month there and had kept it ever since. She walked over to Daniel. She stood silently beside him. He asked what was new in the forest.
She replied that she'd seen the potter's tracks by the northern stream, 3 of them, heading east, not toward the castle, past it, but she'd set up an extra guard post, just in case. He nodded. She left, with a light step, silent. She moved through the castle just as she moved through the forest, invisible, but everyone knew she was there, and everyone felt safer because of it. Kana came out of the infirmary. Her apron was stained, her hands were green with herbs, her dark hair was tucked under a scarf. She looked tired. She always looked tired, because she was always working. But this was a different kind of tiredness, not the exhausted, hollow weariness she'd arrived in Westerland with. It was the tiredness of someone who had a purpose, a goal, a place. She approached him and said that a peasant woman from the village below had given birth to a boy. He's healthy. The mother is healthy. His name is Daniel. He blinked. She said the peasant woman had named her son after the Baron, because a year ago, Hannah had saved her first child during a blizzard, and it was the Baron who had brought Hannah to Westerland. Daniel was silent. Then he said, "That's it." He fell silent. Then he said it was the strangest compliment he'd ever received in his life. Hannah smiled, a genuine smile, a warm one. She smiled more and more often, not often, but more often, and every time it was like dawn breaking in a room that had long been shrouded in darkness. Madeline left the castle with a parchment, a plan for the day. She always started the day with a plan. That was her, structure, order, control, but a different kind of control, not that tight, suffocating control she'd learned over 10 years with her husband. Light, lively. She knew she could let go and nothing would fall apart, because there were people nearby who would pick up the slack. She looked at Daniel and said that today was their anniversary. He said yes. She said that Barris was preparing a celebratory dinner and that she'd allowed him to use the last barrel of good wine, because some occasions are worth a barrel. He said he completely agreed. Serafina was the last to come out. As always, she wasn't a morning person, but she was the kind of person who never missed anything important. She walked up to him with a mug of herbal tea in her hand, the very same one Hannah made every morning. Serafina had been drinking it since the first month, at first because there was nothing else, then because she'd gotten used to it, then because it was the herbal tea that Hannah made just for her, with mint, because Hannah remembered that Serafina loved mint, a small thing, but over the course of a year, those little things had grown into something for which Daniel couldn't find a word in any language. Serafina stood beside him. She drank the tea in silence. Then she said the annual report was ready, that revenue had grown by 400%, that if the current trend continued, in 2 years, Westerland would be among the top 10 most profitable baronies in the kingdom, and that she needed an assistant because she didn't have time to do the math. He said Tim was good at math. She replied that Tim was 4 and that he confuses crowns with oars. He replied that when she was 16, someone had also entrusted her with the numbers. She looked at him. Then she snorted. She said, all right, she'd give it a try. That evening, dinner. A large table in the dining hall. Not 6 seats, 20. Daniel, 5 wives. Alvin, Barris, Roderick, Mira, and Nell. Tim, Garth, Thomas the carpenter, Kovan the guard, the fisherman brothers, Alice Thorne. She'd arrived 2 weeks ago. She'd left the Holts. She came to Westerland. Serafina met her at the gate and silently led her to the study. An hour later, Alice emerged with a to-do list for the week. She was home. The table was groaning under the weight of food. Barris outdid everything he'd ever made before. Roast venison, 3 kinds of smoked fish, fresh bread with herbs, cheese made from the milk of goats brought by the refugees, honeyed nuts, wild berry jam, a berry pie that Mira had been baking all day, and wine. Not the sour stuff from a forgotten barrel in the cellar. The real thing, red, from Redmark. Serafina had bought 3 small barrels and called it a strategic reserve. Daniel stood up. He raised his mug. Everyone fell silent. 20 faces were watching him.
He said that a year ago he'd woken up in this castle and didn't know how many sacks of flour were in the cellar, that now he knew 412. Serafina nodded in agreement. He said he wouldn't make any long speeches, that everyone at this table knew what had been done. Each of them had done their part, not because they were ordered to,
but because they decided to. He said the only promise he'd made on his wedding day was that everyone in this house would be safe, that his word would carry weight, that his door would lock from the inside. He asked if he'd kept his word. Silence. Then Una raised her mug, silently, without a word, in a single motion, like a blade from its sheath. Ashley raised her mug. Hannah raised hers. Madeline raised hers. Serafina was the last. She raised hers, and for the first time in a year, looked at him not with cold, businesslike, or judgmental eyes. She looked at him the way you look at someone you trust, completely, unconditionally. 20 mugs in the air, silence. Then Barris called out from the kitchen that the pie was getting cold. Everyone laughed. Everyone. Even Alvin. Even Una. Even Serafina. Dinner lasted 3 hours. Barris brought out seconds 4 times. Tim spilled wine on the tablecloth, and Madeline didn't say a word. She just shifted her napkin. Ashley tasted wine for the first time and grimaced so much that Una burst out laughing. Hannah was quietly humming something in a language no one knew. A southern lullaby. Mira cradled Nell on her lap, and he fell asleep amid the noise and laughter. Roderick was telling Garth about how in his village, a goat had climbed onto the roof of a blacksmith shop, and Garth laughed so hard he banged his forehead on the table. Alice was counting something on a napkin, and Serafina peered over her shoulder and corrected her, even at the holiday table. Daniel sat at the head of the table and watched. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to manage. He didn't need to coordinate, delegate, or optimize. He simply sat among people who, a year ago, didn't know one another, who among people who had become a family, not by blood, not by decree, by choice. Later, at night, he went out onto the wall, alone. Summer, stars, a warm breeze from the fields, the scent of mown grass and smoke, and something floral from Hannah's clinic. He stood and looked out over his lands, at the dark fields, at the village with lights in the windows, at the forest beyond the river, at the road leading south into the direction. A year ago, he died on the wet asphalt in Chicago, with a knife in his liver, with an unfinished quarterly report, thinking that this was a stupid way to die. Now he stood on the wall of a castle at the edge of a world that shouldn't exist. A baron, husband to 5 women, head of a household of 112 souls. A man named after a newborn child. A man with 412 sacks of flour and 5 schedules on the wall. And a team he didn't deserve, but for which he was ready to work until the end of this new life. There was much ahead. Ashtor would not give up. The great houses would stir. Sooner or later, the crown would decide that Westerland had become too conspicuous. The mystery of the binding decree remained unsolved. 5 women and 1 ancient prophecy. Someone wanted to bring them together for a reason. And whoever chose the body Daniel had ended up in hadn't acted by chance either. The second year would be harder than the first. He knew that. But he also knew that behind him, in the castle, 5 women were sleeping. Women who had arrived a year ago dressed in black and hadn't spoken at dinner. Now they were sleeping in their own rooms, with the keys he'd given each of them on their wedding day, with doors that locked from the inside, with their names on parchment on the dining room wall, with their responsibilities, with their places, with the right to speak, the right to make mistakes, and the right to laugh at the table. They were a team, not because he had appointed them, because they had chosen to be. The door behind him creaked. He turned around. All 5 were standing in the doorway. Madeline, Serafina, Hannah, Ashley, Una. They had come, without a word, without a reason. They just came. Madeline stepped forward and stood to his right, Una to his left, Ashley behind him, resting her forehead against his back, because that was how she'd stood on that winter night when they'd fought off the first mercenaries, and ever since then, that had been her spot. Hannah stood in front, checking his hands. A habit. She always checked his hands. Serafina was the last to arrive. She stood slightly to the side, arms crossed, with a slight smile, the very one that lasted not just 3 seconds, but as long as she wanted it to. 6 of them against the wall, stars overhead, a warm breeze, silence. Daniel stood among them and thought. A year had passed.
The department was stable. Processes were in place. The team was in place. Metrics were rising. It was time to move on to the second year. He smiled, the kind of smile you only give at home. For the first time in 2 lifetimes. Forever.